Okay, it is now 9 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. And I got the thumb ups. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Delta Stewardship Council meeting. Today is Thursday, August 24th. If you will please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'll now ask Emma, if you will, our council clerk, if you will please take roll call.
Councilmember Burgess.
Here.
Councilmember Damrell.
Here.
Councilmember Weso.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Zingali.
Good morning from Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District here.
Chair Medueno.
Medueno here. We'll now move on to item 3, public comment. Emma, if you will lead us in that as well.
If any member of the public is interested in providing public comment on any agenda item during today's meeting, please send an email blue card to engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov or as seen on the screen. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item that you wish to speak on. When called, the clerk will unmute you.
Thank you. Emma, is there any public comments?
No, Madam Chair, there is not.
Daniel, is there any public comment from your side?
Not at this time, thank you.
And by the way, good morning and good to see you.
Likewise.
We will now move on to the consent calendar. Items for consent calendar are expected to be routine and again, nothing controversial. The council will be asked to approve items. Again, is there anything on the consent calendar that needs to be pulled or for further discussion? If not, then I will entertain a motion for the adoption of the July 27th, 2023 meeting summary.
The motion for approval. I'll second that.
Moved by Councilmember Lee, a second by Councilmember Burgess. Are there any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay. We will go ahead and do roll call for the acceptance of.
For Councilmember Zingali's
That's right,
location.
sorry.
No public comments here either.
All right, I will begin the roll call. Councilmember Burgess.
Yes.
Councilmember Damrell. Councilmember Weso.
Yes.
Councilmember Lee.
Aye.
Councilmember Zingali.
Aye.
Chair Medueno.
Aye. Moving on to the chair's report. A couple of items that I'd like to bring up. At our last council meeting, we had a very, what I thought informative, very engaging discussion with regard to educational programming on the Delta. And I was a guest at the Stockton Rotary not too long ago, and I was approached by a teacher in San Joaquin County who asked if there was any resources or if there were any resources that we could put her in contact with, because she said she has so many students that live in and around and adjacent to the Delta, and she just felt that there was so much need for more students to learn about the great Delta that they live in, that they get to embrace every day. And being Native American, she really felt that it was her calling to be able to do more, to educate, again, more students and to engage more students. And again, we had our last meeting in Ileton and thought about that great presentation that we had to cut a little bit short because we were running out of time. So I asked this teacher by the name of Destiny to get in touch with our staff, and I asked our staff to put her in touch with DWR and the great presenters that we had, and who are just taking this whole notion of educating and inspiring young minds to learn more about the Delta. So it was a good reminder for me, but also I thought, well, we should actually bring that group back, because I really felt like we cut them short, and I just didn't want our council. I know there were some questions from some of you, the council members, that also felt we were a little too rushed and didn't get to ask all the questions that you wanted. So I definitely want to invite them to come and finish, if you will, the business that we had in Ileton. Also, just wanted to share that we are having more and more discussions. Unfortunately, I'm looking at Laurel now, our lead scientist. Laurel will be leaving us a little bit sooner than expected. And so as much as it pains me to say that we're going to lose Laurel, but I'm super excited for your future. And I know that you are doing the best for you and your family. So we absolutely congratulate you on your new venture, but we will miss you, no doubt. But we are having, again, a series of conversations with the Independent Science Board. We're going to be starting that process. I have extended an invitation to Councilmember Lee to join us as part of the interview panel for our next lead scientist. And so I'm really, really happy to report that, again, Councilmember Lee will be using her expertise and her background to help us in this next venture. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Department of Water Resources. We have our distinguished panel that are joining us again today, and that is Lynn Takata, who is a senior environmental scientist with Department of Water Resources. We have Kathy Schultz, water education specialist, and Dr. Melinda Bergwald, manager of the Collaborative Science and Innovation section, again, for the Department of Water Resources. And ladies, again, a pleasure to see you, and thank you so much for coming back and indulging us to be able to have more of that discussion that we were not able to have in Ileton.
Thank you, Chair Madueño, and good
thank you.
morning, council members. My name is Lynn Takata. As Chair Madueño introduced me, I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Science Program. And I want to thank you for inviting us back to finish up that agenda item from last month. I have here Kathy Schultz, well, Melinda Bergwald and Kathy Schultz from DWR as well. Before we launch into the question and answer, I just wanted to give you a quick little recap on the last month's item. So the item was all about DWR's Delta Education Program, which stands for the Developing Environmental Literacy Taking Action education program. And it focuses on connecting middle school students from the Rio Vista community with working agency scientists to learn about the science, the ecology, and the water management in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. DWR developed the curriculum through partnerships with the Solano Resource Conservation District, Riverview Middle School, and D.H. White Elementary to make sure that it met California's standards and met the needs of the teachers without providing a new burden on their already packed educational schedules. The curriculum itself is all about hands-on engagement rather than the traditional lecture-based learning format. Students learn through activities like examining real Delta organisms in microscopes, mocking up their own water delivery system, doing real field sampling, and by engaging with real scientists. Despite some challenges, many of the students seem to really enjoy the education program. And the hope is that it will help them see that science could be something that they could consider as part of their future. That said, the main hurdle that remains for the Delta education program is resources, lack of dedicated resources. All of the scientists, educators are volunteers, and they generally donate their time on top of their regular full-time work. That includes Kathy and Melinda here. Kathy already had an overfull plate before the Delta program. She is like the busiest person. It's amazing how much she does. Melinda's other life also is really as a geneticist and manager of a team developing new technologies for biological monitoring. So really for both of them, the Delta program is an extra time passion project. Unless either of you have anything to add, and I think I stole your microphone, we can launch into question and answers and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that there were some questions from council, so I'll ask. If not, I have some questions. And we'll start with Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, I had a question. I know that you were talking about the program being mostly handled by volunteers, which is so commendable. And you're thinking now that it's kind of in maybe a pilot phase, and if it was to be expanded as a program, I was wondering if you guys have thought about proposing a BCP or partnering with Department of Education or something to try to find funding.
So yeah, you are correct that it is in pilot. We really have only done 2 years of this. At this point, given the short amount of time that we've been doing it, we haven't been thinking about BCP's budget change proposals, but that's absolutely something that we could consider. And I actually would strongly encourage that, particularly Kathy. She is a one-woman operation in terms of water education for DWR, and she's extremely talented and could do so much if she had a team to support her.
So here's where I was going with this. When I first came onto the council, I was approached by a couple of staff members here at the Delta Stewardship Council and said, Virginia, it would be really good if you could help and if we could start looking at how do we grow diversity even within the council itself and the makeup of the council. And we are such a heavily science-based agency in the state of California. And I look at the communities in and around the Delta, the 5 counties, and I think, how can we help, again, to expand diversity and knowledge, if you will, of the Delta? And I'll use myself as an example. So I was raised in the community of Riverbank, the river, obviously being front and center. And I can tell you that I was never exposed to the river. My only exposure was when my parents would take us to Jacob Myers Park and the river was right there. But we were never introduced to the river. We were never introduced to the ecology. We were never really introduced to water management, water quality, organisms. And I'm thinking, if we had these kinds of programs, especially in communities that are predominantly lower income, communities of color, wow, imagine what we could do to expand, if you will, the landscape of increasing, if you will, the sciences in some of these communities that have never been exposed. And I'm thinking, if we could partner with agencies that really have the opportunity to provide resources more on the STEM side, and we can introduce more young women, more young men, and again, those that are in communities that are, again, what I would consider disenfranchised, I see that you could probably qualify for some grants outside of the government, the traditional government structure. And one that comes to mind is Emilio and Gloria Estefan. They launched a program called Latitude, even though they're based out of Miami, but they are a national program. And that's what they do. They provide funding, again, to be able to augment and expand opportunities where, again, people of color have not been traditionally brought into the fold. So I would love to see, those kinds of opportunities. I love what Councilmember Lee just approached. If we can, again, look at, maybe additional resources through the Department of Education. But I do see that the Delta is such an amazing, amazing thing, if you will. And the more that we can expose young minds to see the opportunities that exist, the opportunities that they can actually use in continuing their education. But we need to start at a young age where we can, again, introduce them. And I love what you said, when you're actually taking them out into the field, it's not just a traditional classroom setting, but actually taking them out to the Delta, taking them out to the rivers so that they understand what it is that this water means. For them, their drinking water, the food that they eat by being, growing agricultural commodities. So I just think that there's so much potential, and I see that it's in your second year pilot. But I just, for me, I'm thinking this is a no-brainer. Why wouldn't we be able to get and help you augment resources so that it's not just volunteer-based, but that we really truly have a comprehensive program that can be sustainable for years to come?
So Lynn and I both sit on the California Environmental Education Interagency Network. It is a 30-year consortium of state agencies that do environmental education. CNRA, Department of Education, and Cal EPA were the founding members back in the 90s. And that's actually the meeting I'm going to have to leave for after we present here. And we meet monthly with education staff from state parks who have their amazing ports program that they do. CDFW has now 2 representatives that come to the CN meetings, and they have a program in the Delta. So I think there's a lot of really good opportunities for partnerships. You know, we do work, we do talk, we do look for ways to collaborate. But like Melinda and Lynn have both said, it really comes down to resources, particularly staff. A lot of our meetings are really spent focusing on how do we accomplish more or even keep accomplishing what we're doing right now with the levels of staff that we have. So yes, there is so much we could do out there and so many opportunities. But it's really going to come down to dedicating those staffing resources to something like this. But we've got the partnerships and the discussions in place. You know, as soon as that happens.
Well, I commend you all. I think it's just admirable what you're doing. And again, when you hear that it's being done on a volunteer basis, you know, my mom will say to you, you're going to earn your little place in heaven. Don't worry, don't worry. But it really does come down to how do we help to support? And so to the degree that I can personally, this council, we'd love to support you. Yes, Councilmember Burgess.
I know this isn't an agendized item, but is there a way that we could write a letter of support that could go to the legislation to encourage that? But I have some other comments. As someone that lives in the Delta, I know that I've worked with kids. My previous life, I worked for a nonprofit working on habitat restoration, water quality, all those kind of things. And one of the things that I've seen, not only heard, but now have experienced and watched, is that until you understand, how can you care? Until you understand that there's this beautiful thing right there in your world, how can you start to protect it and have pride in it and want to take care of it? And so being able to see the impacts that stormwater has on the local creek or into the river tells someone that they need to be careful about how they use chemicals on their lawns or making sure the garbage gets into the garbage can. And what struck me from your presentation last month was that they didn't see scientists in themselves, and that what you were doing was helping them discover that inner scientist in them. And I can see the pride and the enthusiasm on your part. And I know I've seen in other schools, you know, we had the tanks of fish, and we were doing something related to the Delta. I know that I've done, you know, water quality testing with high schools, but I love middle school because that's such a pivotal time in sense that they've kind of learned the base of how to learn, and now they're starting to collect things that they actually know. And so I just think that this is a program that we should, you know, help lift up. Come to Contra Costa, I'll help you. But I do think that for the Delta, for those counties, it's really important for those kids, especially those. I have a lot of kids in my county that live right next to the water and have never been on the water or in the water or even understand that the Delta and the bay and the interactions of watersheds. They don't understand that at all. And it's such an easy laboratory to get them to. So I think that we should be lifting this type of program up I thank you for taking the limited amount of time that you have and bringing it, because who knows, you might be helping develop the scientists that will help us have the answers that we need in the future.
Thank you, Councilmember Burgess. Seeing no
Madam
other, oh yes, I see Councilmember Singali. Yes, please.
Thank you. And thank you panelists for coming back. I also really hope that our platform here can somehow be a catalyst for more resources for the good work you're doing. I've been thinking since the last time you were here, I was curious. I'm glad to have the opportunity to ask, how do you navigate giving the students the context, the mega context of the climate crisis, which it seems to me you have to have that context to understand what's going on in our world. How do you navigate the fact that that's, for baffling reasons, controversial? Have you had pushback from parents or community about teaching the facts about the climate crisis or the context? Or I'm just curious how you navigate that in a classroom.
For my part, as a scientist, I truly believe that science is fact, and that we teach the scientific facts of the argument. And quite honestly, we have not gotten any pushback on this. I believe that for my own children and hearing what they learn in school as well, science in a lot of classrooms is being taught with the facts in hand, and not shying away from letting children know about our climate crisis. And we don't either. We do we don't tiptoe around those topics, because they're science topics and we're in a science classroom.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear you haven't had pushback. And is the same true of do you offer context, and has there been any controversy around the history of inequity and the treatment of Native Indigenous people with regards to water? Does that come into the curriculum? And if so, has that generated any controversy?
That's not part of the curriculum at this time. For example, with the 7th grade, we're really focusing on the macroinvertebrates and really focusing on that piece of science. When we're looking at the different programs, we're trying to be very holistic, and those topics can certainly fit into, I think, the 6th grade program, in looking at how water is distributed throughout California. But one of the things that we're trying to do with the program that we're doing is be very focused, and identify what standards we're helping the teachers meet, and have the lesson be very focused and targeted for the students, because we do have a very limited amount of time with them. I just want to add to the question about climate change. As Melinda said, we don't shy away from it. It's part of the lesson. I think we could just as easily get pushback on evolution as a topic. The science teachers have been encountering this sort of pushback for many, many decades. I have training in climate communication, and there's best practices for teaching climate change at different ages for the students. And so we integrate it into the lessons that we're teaching, and try and make it, part of the whole story of the Delta. And as I think we mentioned last time, we are doing revisions to the lessons, always kind of modifying them, trying to make them stronger. And I think the issue that you brought up about Indigenous relationships with water, rights to water, the inequities of water, which I do think we actually brought in this past year. Did we not? Yes, we did actually bring in some of the water inequities with the 8th graders this year. So, as we refine the programs, I hope we'll keep making them stronger.
I really appreciate your openness to that. We had representatives from the tribes recently make a very compelling case about how it's really impossible to understand where we are with water in the state without understanding where we've been. And their story obviously is a huge part of that. Thank you again for what you're doing.
Great. Seeing no other questions, again, thank you so much. But before I let you go, is there any public comment on this item?
No, Madam Chair, there is not.
And
None here.
Councilmember?
No
I'll
public.
leave- No, okay, great, thank you. Thank you so
If I
much.
could add one thing.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that you had been approached by somebody who was interested in resources. There are so many resources out there. In Contra Costa County, you have the, Big Break is an amazing educational resource. The Stockton area water suppliers all band together and hire somebody who goes into the schools and does water education. So if any of your constituents are ever looking for water resources, please do not hesitate to contact me, because even if we don't have the capacity to go in and do all those programs, I have a network of over 200 water educators that I work with throughout the state, and we can usually find somebody or some resources to bring to them. The other thing I just wanted to share with you is that DWR has moved into the 21st century. We have just gotten approval to purchase several educational technology programs, and so we can, while we can't necessarily bring half a dozen scientists into everybody's classroom, we can make some of the resources from this program more widely available. So I'm really excited about that.
Excellent. Congratulations on that. That's super exciting. Thank you. Had no idea that you had all these resources. So yes, Kathy, I know you're overwhelmed, but that's okay. We can overwhelm you a little bit more. All in the good. All in.
That's my job. I put people in touch with the resources they need.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so very much, and appreciate you coming back. Thank you. We will now move on to item 6, our executive officer's report. And for that, we have our esteemed executive officer, Ms. Jessica Pearson.
Thank you. Good morning. I have a couple of announcements in my report. I'm going to start with an update on covered action certifications. So for covered actions, last month I reported that on July 8th, the Solano Resource Conservation District submitted a Delta Plan certification for the Ulatis Creek Habitat Restoration Project. The project's 30-day review period expired on August 7th without an appeal. We have one remaining active covered action. On July 31st, the Department of Water Resources submitted the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan certification of consistency. Updated every 5 years, DWR prepares this plan to reflect a system-wide approach to improve integrated flood management in lands protected by the State Plan of Flood Control. The 30-day review period is currently underway and will end on August 31st. On July 28th, the council sent a letter to the Department of Water Resources regarding their Little Egbert multi-benefit project. This project seeks to manage the transition of land on Little Egbert Tract to transition from agriculture to wetlands and riparian habitat in a manner that maximizes flood benefit, climate resilience, ecosystem processes, and recreational opportunities. The letter states the project appears to be a covered action and outlines our initial comments with regards to consistency with the Delta Plan, and we encourage them to engage with us in early consultation. We do have one currently open tribal consultation period. The council is seeking early consultation with interested tribes and tribal organizations on the development of our climate change adaptation strategy named Delta Adapts. In particular, the council is interested in guidance on recommended climate adaptation strategies, how to best recognize and advance opportunities for tribes to utilize tribal knowledge, and how to encourage opportunities for co-management in the Delta in the context of climate adaptation. This consultation period is open until August 31st, and any tribes wishing to consult on these or other efforts should reach out to our tribal liaison, Brandon Chapin, at tribal.liaison@deltacouncil.ca.gov. One personnel announcement to share. Dr. Dylan Chappell has been promoted from Senior Environmental Scientist to Environmental Program Manager of our Adaptive Management Unit in our Delta Science program. Dylan has been with the council in the Adaptive Management Unit since 2018 and has led critical initiatives supporting the Delta Science program's core function of facilitating adaptive management, including supporting agencies in implementing adaptive management in their restoration projects. He's also been very active in helping out with our DPIC ecosystem restoration subcommittee. So please join me in congratulating Dylan. We're excited about this new role. So the outreach highlights report and our active projects lists are both available in your board packets and online, also on the back table for those in the room and interested. And now I'm going to invite up Brandon Chapin for a legislative update, as well as our executive fellow, Viet Long. This is his last meeting, so he's also going to address the council with a few remarks and reflecting on his fellowship period with the council. So welcome to Brandon and Viet Long.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, Chair and council members. At the request of Councilmember Hueso, I thought I'd go over just a few of the bonds right now and just kind of go over what is in them in terms of things that are related to the Delta and Delta management. So if I can get the first slide. Thanks. So AB 305 is from Assemblymember Via Pudua. The total amount of this bond is $4.5 billion. Of note, for particular Delta funding that would be applicable in the Delta, there's about $1 billion for multi-benefit flood protection projects, another $1 billion for urban flood risk reduction, another $1 billion for Sacramento San Joaquin Valley flood management, and then lastly, $500 million for levee rehabilitation and upgrades. So this one is, so in total there are about 4, and this bond is on the smaller side and is only focused on flood funding. Next slide. AB 1567 by Assemblymember Garcia. This is a much larger bond and also encompasses a lot more topics. I'll read off the full name just to give you an idea of everything that's in this bond. So it's the Safe Drinking Water, Wildfire Prevention, Drought Preparation, Flood Protection, Extreme Heat Mitigation, Clean Energy, and Workforce Development Bond Act of 2024.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
So lots of things that are in this, but in particular in relation to the Delta, there's about $200 million to the Department of Water Resources for flood management projects. 50 million of that is specifically for projects in the Delta. 150 million to DWR for flood protection and climate resiliency in the Delta. 300 million to the Water Board for water recycling projects, and part of that is to prioritize projects that reduce reliance on the Delta. And then lastly, 35 million to the Delta Conservancy for climate resiliency projects. And I'll give one more caveat too, I didn't mention before all this. These are all just preliminary bonds. These are not guaranteed or anything like that. Next slide. Next, we have SB 638. This is from Senator Eggman. This is another bond that is focused on flooding. So this is Climate Resiliency and Flood Protection Bond Act of 2024. This has $500 million for flood protection and climate resilience in the Delta. At least $200 million of that is for local assistance through their subventions program. And then the remaining funds can be used for subventions, special projects, or emergency response. The special projects portion of that is particularly for the purpose of preservation, protection, rehabilitation, and improvement of existing levees, and to improve protection against the threat of earthquake and sea level rise. And then one other part that's part of that bond is for this grant program for the flood protection and climate resilience. DWR has to have 4 public meetings, including one that would be in the Delta for the funding guidelines. And then one last note for this is that this is co-joined with SB 867, which is the next bond I'll mention here in a second, which means that both bonds have to pass for them to become effective. Next slide. Lastly is SB 867. This is another large bond. This is $15.5 billion. And this one, again, I'll read off the name: the Drought, Flood, and Water Resilience, Wildfire and Forest Resilience, Coastal Resilience, Extreme Heat Mitigation, Biodiversity and Nature-Based Climate Solutions, Climate Smart Agriculture, Park Creation and Outdoor Access, and Clean Energy Bond Act of 2024. Yeah. Yeah. Faster, yes. So in particular for the Delta, in this one, there's $1 billion to the California Natural Resources Agency for flood management, and that's to be allocated within the agency as the agency sees fit, including for projects in the Delta. $50 million to the Delta Conservancy for climate change impact reduction to communities, fish and wildlife, and natural resources. and then 400 million also to the Natural Resources Agency for nature-based solutions, and similarly to be allocated as the agency sees fit. And then again, this is the one that's co-joined with Senator Eggman's bill as well. So those are the 4 active bonds in the legislature, bond proposals in the legislature. I will, just in terms of next steps on these, so the governor has signaled an openness to run a bond to alleviate some of the cuts and pressure from the budget to natural resources. So there's currently negotiation. All 4 of these bills are currently held in their policy committees, while legislative leadership and the governor negotiate on what a final bond will look like. I'll add that there is other circumstances going into this, complicating matters. There's at least a few other bonds totaling upwards of $100 billion on in the legislature this year. And so a lot of discussion about bonds regarding not just flood protection and natural resources, but also healthcare, education, housing. So a lot of negotiations on bonds right now for whether it's what's included, the size, and then also in terms of whether it's on the March or November ballot next year. As far as the council, staff have been active in an initiative that has been being led by the Delta Conservancy to get state agency representatives together, working to discuss Delta funding needs over the next 10 years, specifically for projects that could be funded by bond funding. So myself, Deputy Executive Officer for Planning Jeff Henderson, and Deputy Executive Officer for Science Henry DeBay have all been participating in those meetings. This group put together a list of those priority projects and subsequent funding needs and provided that to agency leadership just for awareness as these discussions go forward. In total, there was about $2.4 billion in funding needs that was identified by this group. Campbell gave an overview of that of the list at the DPIC Restoration Subcommittee meeting last week, but that list does include projects such as the Yellow Bypass, Frank's Tract, levee needs, implementation of Delta Adapts, and the ecosystem chapter of the Delta Plan, the National Heritage Area, among many others. So that group plans to meet annually, or at least annually, to update its funding needs and keep a running list, and as well as expand that group's participation, include local government and community voices in the future. So I'll continue to keep the council updated on these bonds as they progress, and happy to answer any questions on any of these.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Questions? Yes, Councilmember Hueso.
I want to thank you, Brandon, for the presentation. Yeah. It was fantastic, and it's encouraging. And although the process right now is suspended because the legislature and the governor decided that with the budget and the trailer bills that they're still working on, that they would dedicate the rest of the legislative period, which is coming to an end, to those issues, and then take up these probably in the beginning of the year. Okay. And so normally, I mean, when those bonds started, they were each about 5 or maybe 7 billion. Now they've doubled. And as you go through the committee process, everyone kind of chimes in and agrees to support if their districts include some level of funding, and that's expected through this process. But as I have found in the past, I think there will be a bond on this subject, and I think there will be funds for the Delta, and I just hope that we stay connected and engaged and have the opportunity to weigh in to prioritize what in the Delta is going to be of most importance, because although it's encouraging to see the numbers, you know, the state is moving in a different direction in terms of trending, in terms of where is the budget going to go next year. It probably won't be at this year's level. This year's wasn't last year. We're kind of trending down, and it's possible that what we see in January in terms of financial projections will not necessarily result in probably increases. It'll probably see decreases, and I think the legislature will take corresponding action in supporting bonds or a bond that is greatly reduced and more in line with what the state could finance in bonds. But the good news is in some of the budget of previous years, when we saw huge increases, we made larger payments to bonds that we had taken earlier, like on the water bond and other financial obligations, so that help, and the pension included. So that will help ease the burden on future budgets. But at the same time, in combination with the rainy day fund that is right now still healthy, I think there'll be a really nice bond coming forward, and I hope that we stay engaged and involved, and maybe communicate to the legislature what we'd like to see in terms of for the Delta. And it's nice to see that there are various members. You have 4 different members that have the Delta on their minds, and that's a really good thing to consider in this process. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Wisdom.
So thank you, and Councilmember Hueso, and obviously with your vast background and expertise, I was going to ask if you or Brandon could answer the question. So as you mentioned, 4 different legislators and a lot of overlap, if you will, with regard to Delta Conservancy, flood management, Delta Conservancy, climate resiliency, all centered around the Delta. So you have 4 legislators, each with their own language, if you will, their own proposals to their own bond. Does that help, or I guess I don't understand how this works, how the process works, but it seems like the Delta is getting its fair share of attention. What can we do as an agency? What can we do to help strengthen? Because I'm super happy to see these big chunks of money being proposed for the Delta, but I also see that there's 4 different legislators. Does that help us? Does that hurt us? At the end of the day, do they all come together and come with one bond proposal that will ultimately go through? Do they take into consideration the Delta communities? They represent, obviously, some of them, like Via Pudua represents a good portion of the Delta, but are they in constant contact with the community to, again, ensure that what they are proposing in the bond meets the needs of the community? How does that work?
Well, I wouldn't call, because there are 4 different bonds, I wouldn't consider that they're in conflict with each other. I just think that there's an appetite between those 4 members to work on, a bond. And that is a very complicated and hard thing to do. Bonds aren't necessarily the easiest legislation to work on. And usually it takes putting together a pretty large coalition to put together a bond successfully. These bonds are still alive, which is a really good sign that the members are working really hard on them. It doesn't say that there aren't other members interested in doing work in this area, because they may not be working on a bond, but they're probably working on legislation. They're probably working on a budget ask. So I expect there are numerous members that represent the Delta, or they're near to the Delta, or that are affected by the Delta, that want to see a healthy Delta, and that are working that in some way or another. So all that, I think that is a positive thing.
Right.
I think it's a wonderful thing that we have 3 different members that have the bond of the Delta on their mind. I think the public and the Delta community should be very encouraged by that, because at the end of the day, I'm very confident that there will be a bond, and I will be very confident that the Delta will get a very healthy share of funding to address some aspect of the health of the Delta. And it'll be, I think, important for us as an agency of people that specifically concentrate on managing the Delta and overseeing the Delta and studying the Delta, that we weigh in somehow, that we find a way to communicate with the legislature and say, we encourage your work. These are areas that are best suited for funding these, and maybe, submitting a list of projects or amounts would be very helpful. Any kind of input and guidance that we could provide the legislature will just help them do a better job at making sure that if they approve something, that it meets our needs.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was very, very well stated. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
And I'll add too, actually, Campbell just reminded me. So the Council, the Conservancy, Delta Protection Commission, and the Water Board are currently working on organizing a legislative Delta tour. And so that's part of it too, is getting the legislators out there to see what's on the ground and what's on the ground essentially. And then the other thing I would add too is just as I mentioned with the work that we're doing with the Conservancy as well in terms of putting that list together. And I think the other thing is the active projects list that we put together too, that we do provide to the legislature, that highlights the current projects that are out there that are part of the that we're tracking as part of the Delta plan.
And Madam Chairman, if I could add,
Absolutely.
in my communication with certain senators and legislators, several have expressed interest in visiting the Delta. And I think that would be an amazing role that we could assume in inviting them to visit the Delta. I think there are other representatives of California that may not be familiar with the Delta or have never visited. And that maybe they don't represent, but should they, I think a visit to the Delta would be very compelling. And would be a wonderful way to gather support.
Absolutely agree. And that is absolutely what we're working on. And taking a look at these individuals that are proposing these bonds, they should be front and center for sure. But super agree with you that we do have a lot of members of the legislature, and not just, from Northern California, but from Southern California that Brandon and I have been in contact with during our legislative visits. And when they ask these certain questions, it tells me that they're not as well versed, if you will, in terms of the communities that the Delta serves and that the Delta represents. So another opportunity for us to do some more of these tours, and definitely more engagement with some of these members that are currently have bonds in their policy committees that we should be in constant contact with. Absolutely agree. So thank you. Any other questions? Looking at Councilmember Zingali, seeing none. Thank you again, and we'll go on to our next panels. Yes. Panel member, I should have said. Panel member.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, and good morning, council members. Right now, I have 6 days left until the end of my fellowship.
No, you don't.
The last day
No, you don't.
will be next Thursday. And yeah, I just wanted to speak about my experience since joining this organization last November. The two words that have really defined this experience for me are variety and trust. The variety of projects that I've been working on has been really fulfilling and really allowed me to explore a lot of my career interests. Very early on, I was pulled in to support the work of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee Restoration Subcommittee. And I'm very proud to have helped organize the first Delta Restoration Forum. And one of my favorite experiences was getting to present the feedback from the community at this forum, to take it back to the higher level, larger DPIC meeting, and to be able to present that to an audience of state and federal officials. That was really like a full circle moment of seeing like the whole life cycle of policy implementation. Another project that challenged me was contributing to our environmental and tribal justice issue paper. It's really inspiring to see the team that's been working so hard on this for multiple years, and it's been an honor to contribute some of my own research and passages to this paper. And throughout the fellowship, I've been tracking state legislation and providing bill analysis when needed. And what I appreciate the most is that I've been able to express my interests in what I would want to work on. And a lot of the time, my mentor team and every colleagues at the organization have found ways to provide that for me. So for example, I was interested in learning the GIS software for creating maps. And right now I've been able to learn some of that and work in that with the help of my coworkers. And another thing is I wanted to try my hand at writing talking points, and I've gotten the chance to do that a couple times for JP. So I think overall I'm really grateful for the trust that's been placed in me by my mentors, Amanda and Brandon. You've trusted me to present to this council only 1 month into my fellowship, and you've trusted me to be a member of this organization. And this trust has really empowered me to feel like I belong in the spaces where decisions are being made, and like I can make a difference in public service. And with the support of my mentors and coworkers, I hope to take this confidence in my abilities to wherever I go next in the next couple of months or decades from now as well. Most importantly, I want to thank my two mentors, Amanda Bull and Brandon Chapin. They've made a great effort to include me in their busy work schedules and to find meaningful work for me to do. And most importantly, I've been able to ask them any question that's come to my mind, and I've gotten to learn how to navigate these spaces and advocate for my own voice. And this mentorship has really, I've really experienced this from everybody at the council. It's really starts at the top with Chair Madueno and JP to the rest of the executive team and everyone else that I've worked with, especially the internal teams around the restoration subcommittee work and also the EJ issue paper. And I think it's important to recognize that I am not the only fellow at this council. There are numerous California Sea Grant fellows, fellows through different programs, and also various interns. And I think this organization is making a lasting difference in young people's lives and empowering the next generation of leaders in the state. And I hope that continues and that many more fellows and interns will experience what I've gotten to experience through this fellowship. And for that, I am eternally grateful, and thank you. And I look forward to keeping in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I don't know where you got your 6 days left. I didn't subscribe to that at all. Viet Long, I just want to say what an honor it has been to work with you, to see you. You have been just a light of just enthusiasm, willingness to learn, engagement. You really propelled. And, you know, the very first time I met you, and then realized it's not just Viet, it's Viet Long. It's not just Viet, it's Viet Long. I had to remember that. But you've been such an amazing addition to our team. I didn't consider you a fellow, I just considered you a team member, and you took the opportunity and just ran with it. And I'm, again, grateful for your willingness to learn, to engage. You put out a lot of work product, and so proud of you. Incredibly, incredibly proud of you. Had the opportunity to sit down and talk about, you know, some future prospects for you. And no doubt, I think that we're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're seeing a future policymaker here. I'm not sure if it's going to be a mayoral position. We talked about that. I don't know if it's going to be a state senator. We talked about that. But I see that there is nothing but incredible opportunities coming in your direction, Viet Long, and you have so much to be proud of. This organization thanks you. We're super supportive of your next venture. Would love to keep you as long as we possibly can, but I understand that these fellowships are for a duration of time, and it's for you to be able to get a little bit of a foundation and to see you soar. So it's almost like being a mother and saying, okay, goodbye, you know, you're 18, go do your thing. But again, super, super proud of you and grateful for everything that you've done for us and excited for your future. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's always a mutually beneficial relationship to host a Capital Fellow, and had a great experience working with Viet Long. And I'm sad to see you go, but we're excited to see what's next for you. So thank you for all the work you've done for the council and for your very kind comments. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay. Looks like Daniel Zingali has a comment.
Councilmember Zingali.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Viet Long, I just wanted to add that I've really appreciated how you've presented always with such clarity and accuracy and sincerity. It really comes through. So it's just been really great to see you represent and speak for us on environmental justice and other things. Wish you a lot of luck. I agree. Your future will be bright. I wish you luck in that future. And I'm kind of put you on the spot here, so if you'd rather circle back later with an answer, that's fine too. But I'd be curious if you think there's anything we as an agency or specifically as a board could do better. Is there some area where you think we can try a little harder or improve? I feel like your advice on that would be well received by all of us.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And yeah, I think a big thing that's sort of I've noticed throughout my fellowship is that uh, this council does a lot of really important work, like significant to the Delta and the entire state, really. And in sort of conversations with, just all the various people I've met throughout my fellowship outside of the agency as well, I've realized that there's so much awareness and knowledge about the Delta and its incredible importance statewide that a lot of people aren't as aware of. So I've really enjoyed, with people that I've met that ask me, oh, like, what does the council do? Or like what's the significance of the Delta? I've really enjoyed being able to speak about my experience and what I've learned here and to share that with as many people as I can. So yeah, I think we're a small but mighty organization, and I hope to see that, with all the work that Chair Madueno has been doing, that I really can see that in the future, that a lot more people will be aware of our mission and how we contribute to the Delta.
Thank you. We definitely take that to heart.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Okay, well, moving on for today's agenda. After our lead scientist report, the council is going to receive a presentation on flood emergency response and recovery during the winter 22-23 high water events. Then staff from the East Contra Costa County Habitat Conservancy and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife will provide an overview of the Knightson Wetland Restoration Project in the West Delta and the use of a recently established CEQA statutory exemption for that project. And with that, I conclude my executive officer's report. Unless there are any further questions, we can move on to public comment.
I had just one quick question, Jessica, on the tribal consultation. Have we had much, I guess, inquiries from some of the tribes saying we'd like to participate in the climate adaptation process?
I would invite Brandon up. He can speak in depth to that. But I think we've been pleasantly surprised with the amount of interest and the tribes that are taking advantage of those consultation periods.
Yeah, I will add, specifically for Delta DAPS, we haven't, but there has been a lot of overlap between this and the environmental justice and tribal issue paper. For the EJ and tribal issue paper, we've received 5 requests for consultation or just requests to be informed of the process as it goes forward. So there's probably a lot of intermingling between the two, particularly if like capacity for tribes, you want to be sure that we're recognizing that. So yeah, I think there's been quite a bit of good response so far.
Great, thank you. And I know it's because of your great work, Brandon. I know that in meeting with some of the tribal representatives that you personally have introduced me to, they do tell me the same thing, tell us, I should say, that they're overwhelmed. They've got so much on their plate, but this is obviously very important to them. And I know it's because you're constantly out there calling, reaching out. And again, just want to commend you publicly, because I know it's your hard work that continues to make sure that they know, that the tribal communities know we want their participation and engagement. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
I see no other questions. We'll ask for public comment. We'll start with public comment here, and then we'll ask for public comment from Councilmember Zingali.
There is no public comment at this location.
Okay.
None here either. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, we will move on now to item 7, and that is our lead scientist report. And for that, we have our lead scientist, Dr. Laura Larson.
Thank you. Well, good morning, Chair Madueno and council members. It's nice to be back in person with you this month after being out for COVID last month. And I'm going to start out as usual with my article spotlight. So if we could get the visual abstract for this item up, that would be great. This month, the spotlight excuse me, is for an article that appeared in our flagship journal, San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science, in its most recent edition. And for those of you who are new to the council, this is a journal that the council provides some support for. The article addresses the ever controversial issue of how endangered fish populations respond to delta inflow, which is an issue that pervades the pending voluntary agreements for the State Water Resources Control Board's update to the Bay Delta Plan, as well as the long-term operations of the State Water Project and Central Valley Project. This issue is also quite relevant to some of the council's active projects, such as the Delta Science Program's current peer review panel for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, focused on the Bureau's aquatic effects analysis for proposed changes to the long-term operations of the Central Valley Project. Speaking of mouthfuls. This aquatic effects analysis will inform a biological assessment, which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service will evaluate to determine whether the modifications to the long-term operations will jeopardize listed species like the Delta smelt and are acceptable under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So currently, one of the requirements that Reclamation and DWR must comply with for operating the water project pumps is a requirement to augment flow through enhanced reservoir releases during the late summer and early fall, like now, of wet and above normal years. The thinking behind this requirement is that higher flows push the range of favorable salinity for the Delta smelt during this time of year to the marshes of Sassoon, where the Delta smelt can then take advantage of abundant food and refuge that the marsh provides. The water releases that cause these favorable conditions are known as the fall X2 action. And you might remember me explaining previously that X2 is a measure of delta outflow that specifies how far upstream from the Golden Gate the salinity at the bottom of the water column is equal to 2 parts per thousand. But the results detailing how successful these costly flow actions might be for actually enhancing populations of delta smelt are mixed, and the requirement has long been controversial. So in this spotlighted study here today, the authors, which consist of a team from ICF Consulting, CDFW, the Department of Water Resources, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, looked at how the availability and composition of zooplankton, which is an important food source for the delta smelt, compared across years with and without that flow augmentation. The years of their data span 2 years with above normal conditions and flow augmentation, 2018 and 2020, and 2 years with below normal conditions and no flow augmentation, 2017 and 2019. They found that indeed in years with flow augmentation, there were more of the zooplankton species preferred by delta smelt, whereas species of zooplankton that are associated with higher salinity and are less favorable to delta smelt were lower in abundance. Now, studies like this do bolster confidence in the conclusion that high flows in late summer and early fall are good for delta smelt by enhancing their food. But this is also a very tricky nut to crack because 2018 and 2020 were wetter than average anyway. So it's hard to attribute whether the improved zooplankton population that was observed in the sampling was actually due to that fall X2 action or the prevailing wetter conditions. This is a persistent challenge in many of the studies that we face of the efficacy of management actions in the Delta, is just distinguishing those management actions from the conditions that essentially triggered those management actions. Also, because delta smelt are so low in abundance in the wild, they're very tricky to sample in reasonable numbers or in statistically robust numbers. So it was not possible to document the effect of the improved zooplankton population on actual delta smelt abundance. I personally will be looking forward to hearing what our review panel says about Reclamation's latest aquatic effects analysis. And as the ISB has pointed out previously, if the voluntary agreements do get incorporated into the Bay Delta Plan update, it will present new opportunities to better understand and try to get some more statistical certainty around that elusive flow-fish relationship in the Delta. So any questions on this particular article? is a pretty straightforward one
Yeah.
this month. So I'm going to move on to the Delta Science Program activities. And the first thing I'll talk about today is our active recruitment for a vacancy on the Delta Independent Science Board. So as probably all of you know, the Delta Independent Science Board is a board of 10 prominent scientists that provides oversight of the science supporting adaptive management of the Delta. Dr. Stephen Brandt on the science board will conclude his second term in January of 2024, right around the corner. To fill this upcoming vacancy, the Delta Stewardship Council has an ad out to seek a prominent scientist with expertise in fish ecology to serve on the Independent Science Board. We released that announcement on July 24th, and the applications were due on August 18th, last week. We did receive 3 applications for the vacancy, and we will be proceeding with interviews in early September. The recruitment team that will be evaluating the candidates consists of myself, Delta Science Program staff, and U.S. Geological Survey representatives. And I hope to bring a recommendation to the council at the October 2023 meeting, and I think our timing should work out well for that. Another ongoing project is the Salinity Management Workshop Series. So just as a reminder, in April of 2023, the first Salinity Management Workshop in this 2-part series was held, and we are now we're conducting active research projects, a modeling demonstration project, and doing planning for a second workshop in the series, which will occur in winter of 2024. So as part of this ramp up to put on that workshop, the Delta Science Program is hosting 2 virtual focused working group meetings this month to explore human dimensions of salinity management in the Delta. And those 2 working group meetings are convening this week. The first was actually held last night from 6 to 7 p.m. And the second will be held from 10 to 11 a.m. this coming Friday. Both working group sessions are offering the same content and present an opportunity to delve into salinity management topics. And they're specifically meant to inform the direction of social science research to better understand the broad range of people who are impacted by salinity management and their perspectives, values, and priorities. So we had a relatively small meeting last week or last night and didn't end up separating into breakout groups. Rather, we had a big group conversation. But we are anticipating larger attendance at the second meeting, and we'll split the participants into small groups to discuss their perspectives on the drivers and impacts of salinity and salinity management in the Delta, provide input on possible salinity management actions, and also identify groups of people who the research teams should continue to reach out to for focused interviews and topically focused groups. So these working groups are also going to provide initial baseline data on stakeholder perspectives, which will allow the research team to document how engagement in a collaborative scenario development and analysis process might actually change perspectives and values and enhance learning. So as I mentioned earlier, the group that convened last night was a relatively small group, but we did have a great and intimate conversation with a lot of focus on salinity management barriers in the Delta. So I certainly learned a lot from that conversation and found it quite helpful. I also have an update for you today on our independent peer review panels, which I discussed in detail I think it was a couple of council meetings ago. And at that time, I provided a report out on 3 independent peer review panels that the Delta Science Program is facilitating. As I mentioned during that meeting, facilitating independent peer reviews is one of our core functions. It's one of the ways in which the science program advances its mission to provide the best possible scientific information to inform water and environmental decision making. It's also a core function that has really been growing. There's growing public awareness that we perform this, and we're seeing increased asks to perform these peer reviews. So today I just wanted to provide a brief update because we recently reached an important milestone with the independent peer review of the State Water Project Delivery Capacity Report, or DCR. And that milestone is that the 3 subject matter experts completed the first part of the review in July, which is now available on our website. That same group of experts is going to begin the second part of their review in late August, and then we expect a final report in October. So just as a reminder, the DCR is a biennial report that provides essential information about the current and projected future water supply capacity of the State Water Project. And Department of Water Resources requested this independent review of the data and methods that are being used in that report to model conditions that have changed and will continue to change as a result of climate change. So the review is 2 parts, and the first part, which was just completed, focused on whether the historical hydrologic data used in the model should be adjusted to account for non-stationarity due to a changing climate. The general conclusion from the reviewers is that the new method to account for this change is an improvement over the previous method. Reviewers suggested that the analyses could be presented a little more clearly to make a stronger case for those methods. And they offered several specific and very helpful suggestions for further improvements to make in future editions of the DCR. So the second part of the review, which is now underway, will focus on risk-informed climate change scenarios to model future performance of the State Water Project system. And again, this is also very relevant to some of the recommendations that the ISB brought to this council in their water supply reliability review. And then there's a couple of things on your radar that are not in your packet, not in your written report, that I'd like to bring to your attention. One is great news, one is bittersweet news that Chair Medueno hinted at earlier. But those of you who have been on the council since last year might previously recall that I brought to you an initiative that the science program was co-developing, which is to develop collaborative modeling resources for the science community in order to facilitate community-engaged scenario-based planning and assessment for water resources management under a changing climate. The initiative has deep roots in the Delta Science program, having been called for since the first Delta Science Plan, as well as in the Science Action Agenda and the Delta Independent Science Board's Science Needs Assessment. Further, its applicability to water resource planning addresses recommendations in the ISB's more recent water supply reliability review. So you might recall that the vision for a so-called collaboratory was furthered in the Delta Science program's integrated modeling framework that we held in February. Related to this, in 2022, in late 2022, the state legislature decided to allocate almost $100 million in funds to the UC Office of the President to stimulate research with direct applicability to California's climate resilience goals. The intent was for teams to develop new agency, academic, community partnerships and develop actionable tools and resources with long-term benefit to the state that would directly enable the state to reach more of its climate resilience goals. So seeing the promise of this opportunity to advance longstanding priorities of the Delta science community, and in my role as a science coordinator for the Delta, I started workshopping ideas with my colleagues at various agencies, community groups, and the academic community, and ultimately partnered with Ted Grantham at UC Berkeley and Eric Danner at NOAA, who had an amazing idea on how to scope the collaboratory with a focus on evaluating how different strategies for water operations would impact water allocations within the Sacramento-San Joaquin River system under different climate change projections, and how those altered water allocations would in turn impact ecosystems and human communities. So that team, led by Ted Grantham, put together an $8.2 million project proposal for COEQUAL, which stands for Collaboratory for Equity in Water Allocations. The project team will work with diverse community members and agency representatives to develop a library of plausible future policies regarding water allocations in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Basin, as well as projected climate futures. They will update and use the CalCIM model, which is the water operations planning model used by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources, to explore the outcome of those policy and climate scenarios. In all, that team will create a library of over 100 different CalSim scenarios with clear visualizations and explanations for the general public, and an interface that allows them to go in and see how their area and their individual interests might be affected. The team will further drill down into the multifaceted trade-offs associated with those water allocations futures for 3 different use cases: salinity management in the Delta during drought, drinking water for vulnerable communities, and Chinook salmon recovery. It was an $8.2 million project that was proposed, and the UC Office of the President just announced yesterday that it was funded. So I think this is a really great advancement for Delta science. And I just want to point out several things that are notable about this project. One is that it embraces the type of participatory scenario-based approach that we used in Delta Adapts. And likewise, it is anticipated to produce information that will be useful for the Council's ongoing adaptation planning. Second, the project truly embraces a vision of one Delta, one science by bringing together partners from 6 different UC campuses, Sacramento State, Department of Water Resources, the State Water Resources Control Board, NOAA, Metropolitan Water District, the Nature Conservancy, the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, the Buena Vista Rancheria, the Karuk Tribe, Restore the Delta, the Cooperative Institute for Water Resources, and the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, as well as the Council, although I personally will not be involved in the project moving forward. I truly believe that this project could be a game changer for how we use science to help address needs for decision-making in this rapidly changing world, and I'm really proud that the science program was a part of the project's development. Looking ahead, Steve Culberson, the Interagency Ecological Program lead scientist and a science program manager, will be representing the Council on the co-equal team. Although I don't have a role in the project going forward, I do plan to produce briefing materials on the project for the next lead scientist, who is anticipated to be integrated into the team and help provide critical connections to the different agencies that we work with, as well as to the Council itself. So this truly is a win for Delta Science, and I think we can expect great things from this team. And then finally, on that note, it is bittersweet that I have some news to share with you regarding my position. It's not news. I know that Virginia made this announcement early in the meeting. But although you only recently reappointed me through June of 2024, I do regret that I will be stepping down from my current role on November 30th this year. I sincerely had hoped to serve out my term, but life throws unexpected twists, and mine is actually some happy news. I will be stepping into a leadership role at a university outside the US in the new year. So it's going to be a big move. The new role is a fantastic opportunity for me to continue to grow as a leader and to find powerful and creative new ways to connect the academic sector to impact in resource management and advancing equity. So while I am very much looking forward to this new position, I will be quite sad to move away from the Delta and this very important work here. I like Chair Medueno's ideas that she expressed at the last council meeting about partnering with sister systems that are experiencing similar challenges. And I already have some ideas about how to connect this community around certain topics that we're working on with my new institution. So I hope not to be a stranger. But thanks to all of you for your strong support of science and of me. I've learned so much in this role, and I will be passing on as much of that learning as I can to my successor, whoever that person might be. And on that note, I would like to say that I am actively working closely with Chair Medueno, Science DEO Henry DeBay, Executive Officer Jessica Pearson, and ISB Chair Lisa Wanger to develop a transition plan that will ensure the continuity of projects and communications. More details will emerge later, but I am confident that this work is all in good hands. And then finally, the by the numbers report, and I don't believe this made it into your packet. You do have it, great. Well, we are having some very strange weather this year. And I hope that those of you from Southern California have been fine through Hillary. Hillary doesn't have much of an impact on the numbers that I'll be sharing with you today, which are based on monthly averages. And I just want to make sure. Oh, I don't actually have a copy of that. So I reran the numbers last night because I wasn't sure if you actually had this in your packet. So forgive me if they're a little bit different. But currently, the Northern Sierra is at 124% of its average precipitation for the year. The Central Sierra is at 161% of average. So still really good numbers. Our reservoirs are similarly high. Shasta is at 127% of what's typical for this time of year, Oroville at 138%, and San Luis at 218% of average. Meanwhile, the Sacramento River is very close to average at 102% of its typical flows for this time of year. The San Joaquin is still very high, 228%, and exports currently sit at about 119%. So it's a really rosy picture for California water right now. Although too much water is not a good thing, as Southern California has been experiencing. So with that, I will conclude my report.
Great. Thank you so much, Laurel. Any questions of Laurel? Yes, we'll start with Councilmember Burgess.
Yeah, it made me think when Hillary came in, how are we in storage in Southern California? Because, you know, we're looking at the numbers here. I'm curious what the numbers were down there as far as their storage goes. And then, I mean, we're looking at a changing climate. If we were to see trends of more of these types of storms in Southern California, just curious if there's a capacity for that source of water and storage.
It's a great question. I don't have the numbers currently for what the storage is at in Southern California. I was just looking because I had all of these statewide reports up on my computer last night, but I think I closed those tabs. But storage is an ever persistent challenge in the California water puzzle. It's going to be one of the biggest barriers that the state needs to overcome as it faces a future that is likely to have both wetter years and drier years than we've seen historically. And so the big challenge is being able to capture that excess water that comes during the wetter years, and the fact that we're losing our snowpack storage. That has been our major source of storage of water in the state. And under warmer climates, more of that precipitation will be arriving as rain rather than snow. And so, you know, last month I talked about the study that focused on the feasibility of using aquifer space in the Central Valley as a major storage source. And I was just, you know, very impressed and surprised by some of the capacities that were alluded to in that report and how they compare to some of the proposed surface water storage sites like the Sites Reservoir.
Yeah. And then the other thing is you did a report a couple months back, and I asked you this before the meeting. I'm fascinated by the impacts that these fires are having on our worldwide weather patterns. We saw the Canadian fires starting when we had that one presentation, and it's not stopped. It's gotten worse,
Right.
it seems like. And then we're seeing, you know, a tropical storm hurricane hitting California. We're seeing, you know, Hawaii, the fire in Hawaii. And so I just think with all of these changing patterns, we're going to have to constantly be pivoting and being ready for it, and just interested. But finally, I just wanted to say thank you for all of your work that you've done. I'm a relatively new member of this committee, but I've just found you to be very helpful, very interested, and really doing a lot of really good things. And I appreciate and wish you the best in your new adventures.
Thank you so much. And this is not goodbye yet. I will be here for at least 2 more meetings. But thank you for those words.
Exactly. Councilmember Hueso.
Thank you very much for the update. And I just wanted to also ask, since we added in the water bond a good amount of money that would create programs working with farmers and working with water districts on doing water capture and infusion into the aquifers, with the hope that we would start to refill California's vast aquifers that have been depleted over the years, that have seen quite a bit of subsidence that has caused numerous problems in the Delta. But this year was a phenomenal year. It brought back Tulare Lake, which at some point will be some form of storage. We don't know how, but I'm hoping that some of that water will make itself way into the aquifer. Probably unlikely, but if that water could be used for something else, that would, you know, and maybe finding a way to put that water into the aquifer. But in your work in that area, have you ever had the opportunity to look at any of those programs that the state has had related to, I know we also did some work with atmospheric rivers and finding ways to capture that water and put it into aquifers. So in your work, have you been able to come across any findings related to those programs and any analysis that has been conducted as to trying to calculate how much water has been added to the aquifer?
So I have not seen calculations of how much water has percolated down to aquifers during this wet year yet. Those may still be coming. I do know that Department of Water Resources has a program that is focused on managed aquifer recharge, and they are actively conducting many of these type of studies. They also have a nice website with resources, and I could get you a link to that. That's probably one of the best starting points for more it's probably the best portal into this world. You're welcome.
Thank you. See no other questions. I don't see a hand for Councilmember Zingali. Thank you so much, Laurel. Great presentation as always. I won't be saying goodbye because this is not goodbye. So we're going to move on to public comment. Are there any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair, there is none.
Councilmember Zingali?
None here either.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Laurel.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that. We will now move on expeditiously to item number 8, and that is the Delta Winter 2023 Flood Damage Assessment. And for that, we have Aaron Mullen, who will make the introduction to our panel. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. We've had a few staff changes. Can you have that down to Brian? Thank you. We've had a few staff changes on who's going to be presenting today. So in replace of Mike Moncrief, we have Gil Cosio, and in place of Liz Bryson, we have Max, and I'm going to hopefully not butcher his last name, Hashuk from DWR. So we don't have nameplates for them, and I just looked, and they were made for Mike and Liz, and unfortunately, fortunately, because we get to hear from some new voices today, they are not here. So I just wanted to start off with that. So good morning, members of the council. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Aaron Mullen, and I'm the supervising engineer for the Stewardship Council. I am excited to tee up this discussion about the Delta Water 2023 Flood Damage Assessment, or Delta Winter, I'm sorry, not Delta Water. I'm going to start with a quick overview of why this is relevant to the council, and I will then introduce today's speakers. The Delta Reform Act tells us that one of the basic goals of the state is to achieve the co-equal goals of providing a more reliable water supply while protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem. It goes on to tell us that this should be done in a manner that reduces risk to people, property, and state interests in the Delta through effective emergency preparedness, land use, and investments in Delta protection. Risk is defined by the probability of an event times the consequences of that event. We can reduce the probability of a levee breach through improving our infrastructure, but we cannot change the weather. Effective emergency management can reduce the probability that a levee breaks through flood fighting and the consequences of a levee breach through effective emergency planning. Emergency management is one of the easiest and most cost-effective ways to reduce risk. As you know, the 2022-2023 flood season brought record amounts of precipitation to the West Coast. Flooding from the numerous weather events caused extensive damage throughout California, but we were able to avoid levee breaches in the Delta through flood fighting and effective emergency response activities. To provide perspective on this today, you are going to be hearing from Gil Cosio, a Delta levee engineer who will be talking about the high water events and how local districts responded. We also have Max Heshuk, manager of the Regional Flood Preparedness Unit, which oversees the Delta Flood Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Program within DWR's Division of Flood Management. He will be talking about the department's Delta-related preparedness programs. And to wrap things up, we'll have Brian Brock, Principal Engineer for DWR's Delta Levees Office, who will talk about how the department supports local districts' recovery after an event. And with that, I will hand it over to Gil.
Thanks, Aaron. Chairman Dueño and members of the council, Gilbert Cosio with River Delta Consulting. I used to be with MBK Engineers, and so that's why Michael called me to step in because I was his boss for a number of years. In fact, a little story about Michael Moncrief. He would have been here today except he had a family obligation that came up, and he would have done a great job because I taught him everything I know. So, but a little story about Mike. I hired him after the 2006 flood. He was working with DWR. His first assignment was a groundwater modeler or something, and then his next assignment was with the Delta Levees program. And so when the flood hit in late December of 2005, he was assigned to the Twitchell Island supply depot. And so I had to make a lot of visits to the supply depot to pick up sandbags and things like that. And I saw this crazy guy in this forklift who wasn't even authorized to drive the forklift, but no one else was there, but he just jumped in and did it. But that's the kind of guy he was. And I realized if this guy's going to be this responsible as a state employee, I got to talk to him. And so we did and hired him. And it's been great ever since. And then he got a lot of good experience in 2017. And so going into this flood, as I'll talk about in a minute, there's a lot of preparation as far as planning and operations and that sort of thing that we worked on since 2017 that really improved how things reacted. We had a little bit of a curveball because of the power outage that affected levee districts, and I'll explain that during my talk. But anyway, these slides are put together by Mike, and I'm going to hit the highlights. Hopefully they're about what he had planned to talk about, and I think they are. But if I miss something that you see and you want to ask a question, let me know. Next slide, please. So the flood season was broken up into two flood events, and these are the flood events that FEMA designates as the incident periods. The first one was essentially the month of January. You probably remember the severe winds we had on New Year's Eve and knocked out power and started causing rainfall and that sort of thing. That was kind of the beginning and went through January. And typically FEMA likes to, once we get through the main storm period, kind of cut off the incident period, and then you're required to put together your damages estimates and whatnot. Well, when you get another storm starting in February, it makes it hard because the incident was closed. And now they have to open up another instance, which they did at the end of February. And this one went to the end of June. And the reason for that is in the Delta especially, we're feeling the effects of the flood for a long time, especially on the San Joaquin side. They couldn't close it off until they were sure the snowpack and the runoff from the snowpack wasn't going to continue to flood people down there. So we had two incidents that the engineers now in the Delta are filing claims and whatnot. A lot of the claims had to do with the power outage and downed trees and stuff that we'll talk about later. But as far as levee damage, there wasn't as much as other years, mostly because of the work we've done to prepare for it and the planning that we did as far as the operations. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a brief description of what happened in those two periods. One of the differences between this flood and some of the other floods we've experienced is that the storage available for holding flood water, especially on the Sacramento River side, was pretty high. And we just came out of a drought, and so the reservoirs were pretty low. One of the problems we did have in the San Joaquin side was that Vernalis, the entry to the Delta from the San Joaquin side, peaked for a number of days, and we could not get it to come down. One of the things that was great is that Liz Bryson's group that Max represents today started convening phone conversations between the locals and the operators, the Corps of Engineers and DWR, to talk about what the locals needed, because a lot of times you can operate a system sitting at a computer in your office and not worry about you're operating like the rules say you're supposed to operate it, but you're affecting people downstream. And that was kind of a key component this year, is that we got together with the operators and let them know what was happening downstream so they could kind of put that into their thinking. Next slide, please. So when I first started working for MBK, we were doing a lot of expert witness testimony. And one of the things I was told is that, you start throwing things on the board, juries and judges don't like to see numbers and, convoluted different images and stuff. So this one kind of defies that recommendation, except what I was told is that what people understand, judges and juries, is big bar and little bar. And so that's all I want you to look at here, the big bars and the little bars. So if you look on the left, that was end of December, and you can see the blue bars are the storage available in the reservoirs, the main reservoirs. And the red line above those blue bars is the top of conservation. So that's where water suppliers want you to be at the end of the year. And once you get above that, then you're in flood space and the operators have to release water. So 2 months later, at the end of February, is on the right, and you can see that blue bar is getting bigger, which helped us in the Delta because we didn't see as much downstream flow, but you can see the reservoir storage is being used up pretty quickly. Next slide. So the second system came through, and on the Sacramento side, we still had a lot of good storage, and the operators kind of really monitored how things went. The Sacramento Weir, which is being reconstructed as we speak, had gates on it, and DWR kind of operated the system so we didn't have to open those gates up and let more water into the bypass, which helped out in the bypass area. On the San Joaquin side, again, it was a little bit more difficult because the snowpack was building up, and we knew that at some point this water would have to be let go, and it'd be starting before June 30th. So next slide. So here's our big bar, little bars again. So on the left, we got the end of February, and on the right, we got the end of April. So 2 months later, you can see what happened. Pretty much all the flood space is used up. Everybody's at the top of conservation. So anything that happens after April, which is our snowpack melting, is going to have to be released. And that's what we're worried about because there's so many millions of acre feet on the San Joaquin side. We're hopeful that we could keep Vernalis at a point where it was encroaching. It was above the monitor stage and into the flood stage, but not a severe flood. Next slide. So here's a couple of slides that I'm sure Max may present in his report. These are you get these off of CDAC, and you can see it's kind of annual conditions. On the top, it's a snowpack as a percent of April 1 average. You can see the green line is 82.83, which was the biggest on record. This is the Sacramento side, but certainly when we look at the next slide, which is San Joaquin, 82.83 was the last time Tulare Lake flooded. And the blue line is right below it. And you can see on the Sacramento side, the blue line started approaching 82.83, then it dropped off significantly. What's interesting is that the chart at the lower left is the total precip, and this last year was not a huge total precip. As of right now, we're at 64.4 inches, and 2016-17 was 94.7, the green on top. So totally different flood. Next slide. So this is San Joaquin side, and as you can see, the upper left shows the snowpack April 1 average, and 82.83 was the big one, but the blue line, which was this year, 2023, actually went above 82.83 and is hugged pretty close to it. So this was one of the bigger snowpack years on that San Joaquin side, and they don't have as much flood storage to begin with. So once it started melting and the reservoirs are full, it started coming down to up to about 35,000 cubic feet per second down at Vernalis, which is right at the flood line, and it held for quite a while. Next slide. Okay, what I really wanted to talk about was one of the things we did to prepare for this flood. There's a requirement called SEMS, a Standardized Emergency Management System. Now, this came about after the 1991 fires in Oakland. I don't know if you remember that. I mean, some people may not have been alive. Some of your staff people certainly weren't alive then. But it was huge because it burned down the Oakland and Berkeley Hills. A lot of real expensive homes were up there. But the biggest problem was it was kind of a mass confusion on getting this thing put out. And what they realized that part of the confusion was they couldn't communicate. This is 1991, so we're in the embryonic stages of cell phones. So everybody had radios. Well, nobody used the same frequencies, the same type of radios, and they couldn't communicate. They started calling in jurisdictions from outside of Alameda County and other fire jurisdictions. They showed up with their fire trucks. They went to hook their hoses up to the fire hydrants, and the couplers didn't work. There are different couplers. And so things like that happened. There was no communication. They had log jams of cars like they did in Paradise. And so the state passed a law that required emergency responders to have some sort of plan in place. And in the Delta, we complied with it to a certain extent. The way it's designed, you have to start from the bottom up. So you have the local agencies calling for help to the county. If they can't do it, then it goes to the state and to the feds. And in the Delta, it was a little hard because the local counties were not all up to the same caliber of staffing of their OES groups. And so this last year, we changed that because the counties all got more involved. And last year, we had some tabletop exercises in every county jurisdiction. And then about a year ago, we had a full-scale exercise, which simulated, essentially, those of us that helped put the plan together, simulated the 1997 hydrology and had a lot of the issues come up. And that was really helpful because we saw we had really improved a lot in our SEMS, but there's still some issues to kind of get over. In one county where I was sitting in one of the operation centers, the county had given us like 15 phone numbers to call. If it's this kind of problem, call this number. And we realized you can't do that. We don't know. We just have a problem. So they changed their ways to say, well, why don't we just have one call, and that dispatch will then direct you to where we think you should be. So things like that popped up. But in general, it worked out pretty well. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what happened. Like I said, we had major power outages. Some lasted a couple days, some lasted a few weeks. And one of the responsibilities of a reclamation district is to drain the land. So it's not flooding from the outside, it's flooding from the inside. And almost all the pumps in the Delta are electric pumps. And so when the power goes out, which we've typically been used to 2, 3, 4 days, you start flooding people's fields. And if you're in an area with a population, then you take a chance of flooding homes. The pictures you see on this slide on the left, the two on the left are from Track. The one on the far left is Woodbridge Road, and it's hard to see in that picture, but that road is cracking because that canal next to the road has never experienced water that high. And so the bank of the canal started getting unstable and cracking the road. The second picture from the left is Track. You see a pipe going over the top of the levee. They were able to bring in a diesel pump and put another pump in to help them out. But even that doesn't help out because these diesel pumps are not as high a capacity as the electric pumps. So a lot of districts actually had to bring in big generators and hook them up, retrofit them into their electric pumps. And that was easier said than done because these generators are not easily available and sometimes they're far away, and just getting a hold of them was hard. But going through the county, they helped out quite a bit to get that stuff. The two pictures on the right are an issue we brought up several years ago that's getting worse and worse, and that's the flooding of Van Sickle Island. It's been overtopping during high tides in June and July. In 1998, if you remember that flood, almost the entire Suisun Marsh was flooded. And right after that, during CalFed, DWR did some studies, and they realized that Van Sickle Island in particular, if it stayed flooded, would impact the water quality of state water projects. So as far as we know, the latest studies are still indicating that. So hopefully before the next flood, we'll have some sort of plan. I know that Campbell had it in his layout of projects at the DPEC last week, that hopefully we'll have something at Van Sickle to control the flooding. To prevent it, it's going to be pretty tough, but maybe control it so it doesn't cause those water quality impacts. Next slide. So what you're looking at on the left is a cover page for emergency operation plan. So back around after the 2006 flood, Ron Baldwin, who was the OES coordinator down at San Joaquin County, realized that he was very hands-on, and he realized that a lot of the people that knew a lot about flooding on islands in San Joaquin County were getting older, retiring from being district representatives or dying. And so he started drafting up what he called flood contingency maps. They were maps that showed the island that was being looked at, any historical issues they had as far as seepage or levee problems, any other historical stuff. And it was just one big GIS map, which worked out great. Well, after Prop 1E, DWR spent a lot of money kind of expanding on those. And so what we've got now is significant improvement on these plans. They're no longer just a single map. The maps are still there, but it's a whole process of what do you have to do as you operate during a flood. And what's key is that even in my career, which is 40 years, I've seen a lot of people come and go. And every time new people come in, you have to retrain them. And sometimes you don't remember everything. And so having this, it's a nice primer to give that new trustee on a district, hey, here's exactly what we have to do. When that gauge at Sacramento hits this, we're doing that. And it's worked out really well. And we have to thank DWR Flood Management for providing the funding, because these are kind of expensive to work on, very intense as far as consulting time. Next item. So this is kind of the conclusion. So like I said, I got to read these here. We went into last year after a drought. Those blue bars were not very big. And so what we're looking at here is the state of the major reservoirs as of last week. And you see a lot of blue, which means they got a lot of water. We're pretty much at the end of flood season. There'll be releases for water quality, as Dr. Larson mentioned, but there's still gonna be a lot of water as we go into the flood season. In fact, if you look at one column, it's kind of hard to read, but it shows the storage in these 6 major reservoirs last August at 5.6 million acre feet. And this August, 1 year later, it's 11.7. So we're talking 6 million acre feet more water. And just to give you an example, the April to July runoff, which is snow melt, was 14.5 million. So if we get an El Nino year that produces a lot of precipitation like they are kind of predicting, actually the staff are going to have to sharpen their pencils and let us keep us from flooding by operating the system very intensely, because we're not going to have much room to have to spare. So next slide. So that concludes my presentation, or Mike's presentation. And here's our contact if you want to contact us. But if you have any questions, I'd really be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gil. Questions of Gil? Yes.
I mean, I have questions, but I think I want to wait till everybody speaks, because, yeah.
Okay, we can do that.
Hello, everybody. My name is Max Kashuk. I'm with the Regional Flood Preparedness Unit with the Division of Flood Management, and I have a few slides to present. The highlights of the topics will be the overview of the State Federal Flood Operations Center, the 2023 activation highlights, and the Delta-related flood preparedness programs such as the Delta Flood Emergency Response grants, facilities and materials, and coordination groups and plans. And can go on to the next slide. Next slide, please. So the overview of the Flood Operations Center. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. So the overview, the highlight, you see the picture on the right, those are the forecast points. Those are gauges that we monitor, and we can forecast and look ahead of time, looking at the weather and predict what stage those gauges will be at. There's a lot more gauges that are not forecasted throughout the state, but we have a few strategic ones that you can see. And the color chart on those, green means no problem. Orange is a kind of monitor stage, or red ones is flood stage, and the purple ones are danger stage. We haven't had many, I think throughout the whole activation, we only had a few times that some gauges hit danger stage. just touched them. So essentially, the Flood Operations Center, we coordinate, DBR's flood emergency preparedness and the response statewide, not only the Delta, but anywhere in the state. We support and supplement local response efforts, and we're also a conduit for federal assistance under Public Law 8499. That's through the Army Corps of Engineers. Essentially, that's usually on the recovery side of things. Next slide, please. This graphic highlights the weather, the storms that we've received from December 22 through January 23. You can see that we had 9 atmospheric rivers in 3 weeks. We had 1 exceptional that pretty much hit the very tip of Northern California. We had 4 strong storms and 4 moderate. And then in March, we had 6 atmospheric rivers, 2 strong, 2 moderate, and 2 weak. In comparison, in water year 2020 and 2021, we had a total of 3 strong atmospheric rivers. So we had basically 3 times or twice as much more this water year in the strong. So a lot more water, and the color graphics basically shows you the precipitation amounts in millimeters. So if you see dark purple, that's that's almost like 10 feet of water. That's through the water year 2023. So in an entire year, that's where all the water fell. Next slide, please. These 2 slides, so the 2 graphics on the left and the right, they represent the one on the left is the Northern Sierra 8 Station Index. Basically, we take a few gauges and we monitor them, and we look at them every year. So you have the dark blue bars, the lines, that's the average precipitation, and the cyan, the light blue color, is basically what we have received in the water year 2023. And you can see that this is as of August 2022, and that jump in August represents the all the precipitation we received this month so far. And needless to say, that's a lot of water. And same thing for the San Joaquin system. You can see that in some months we've more than doubled the average precipitation in those areas. The next slide shows the snowpack. And as Gil mentioned, you have the green line highlighting the 1982-83 snowpack year. That was considered to be the largest snowpack on record. And the dark blue line sometimes exceeded or got very close to the maximum snowpack. And luckily we had mild and cool weather throughout the spring and the summer months, that we didn't have a large snow melt all at once. So it was a lot of snow melt, and it was steady, and it was just enough to kind of keep things without breaking levees and overflowing reservoirs. The next slide highlights the DWR response. The flood operations activated twice. The first time we started January 3rd to January 20th. As you may recall, we had storms that were in the months of December. So we were watching those, we were working, we were monitoring the situation, but officially we started the activation on the January 3rd, and then again in March 9th and through June 30th. That's because of the snow melt. We were monitoring the snow melt and providing the information and the resources to the locals to make decisions in terms of what's expected to come down via snow melt. We did deploy flood fight specialists, geotechnical engineers, and California conservation crews, and also incident command teams. And most of those deployments were down to the San Joaquin system, just because there were more events happening there. The Sacramento system, we had a few things there, but it's large enough in terms of ability to pass water through the system that we didn't have to send major crews or have a major response. So primarily our efforts were focused on the Tulare Lake area and kind of up to the Delta. And we've coordinated with the National Weather Service, CNRFC, Army Corps of Engineers, Caltrans, Cal OES, various county OES and local maintaining agencies in terms of the responses and providing the resources that they may need. And we gave them things like flood fight materials, liaisons at multiple emergency operation centers, and also the river, reservoir, and snowmelt forecasting. That was several times a day, seemed like at most. And our flood operations center staffing peak was 266 staff, and we had 82 statewide incidents. Now, the next slide will highlight the direct assistance in the Delta region. Reclamation District 2064 had a waterside erosion in January and then landslide seepage in March, and Reclamation District 2095 had a waterside erosion, and that's the image that you can see that we've
Can you clarify where those reclamation districts are?
So these reclamation districts would be in the legal delta. They're at the very beginning of the delta. So Vernalis Gauge, San Joaquin River, basically it's kind of at that very beginning of the delta. So at the tip. So we're very close to I-5. I can give you more detail if you like, but that's the general vicinity. You can see these districts as you're driving down I-5, kind of where that Del Oso pumpkin patch, right there. So we've deployed flood fight specialists, to evaluate these concerns in areas, and Division of Engineering provided the heavy-duty resources to place this large rock that you can see in the picture. That's not something that a triple C crew can do. You need heavy machinery for that. So we've participated in various coordination meetings. Like I said, we had a liaison in the San Joaquin Emergency Operations Center pretty much throughout the whole time. And we also provided an inundation mapping, modeling, and key intel for advanced planning efforts, to kind of help out with the decision making in the Delta, especially because depending on how much water comes in, certain things need to be done in the Delta to prevent island flooding. Now, the next slide will show kind of the flood emergency response grant purpose. So the idea behind that is to provide resources to enhance local flood emergency and preparedness response in the Delta region. And next slide, please. The grant program is essentially, it's has a geographic scope, so it has to be the legal delta, and applicants must have jurisdiction fully or partially within the legal delta. The focus of the Delta Flood ER grant program is that projects must reduce the risk of levee failure and or flood in the legal delta. And the applicants would have to be California public agency with primary responsibility for flood emergency response and coordination. That can be a county, a city, a local maintaining agency, any kind of water, maybe irrigation district, anybody that is involved with the efforts of reducing the flood risk. The next slide highlights the three main activities. Number one would be planning and coordination. That's essentially to answer the question of what to do. So you make plans, you make maps, you coordinate with your partners to establish lines of communication, things like that. And the second part would be answering the question of how to do it. So the training and exercises, that can be anything from tabletop, virtual soft kind of exercises, running scenarios, or even field exercises. And the third would be facilities, materials, and equipment. So make sure you have supplies ready to go if you're building stockpiles or strategic locations, identifying that. So we provide kind of funding for all those three aspects. So those are the three eligible activities under the grant program. The next slide will highlight the, I would say the main Stockton Weber material transfer facility in the Delta. That's right next to I-5 in Stockton. You can see it off the freeway when you're driving by. There's lots of rock, sheet piles, all kinds of materials, sandbags. And this is a very strategic location just because it's located basically right off I-5 and in the shipping canal. So you can pull up a barge load up the barge and transport materials via the waterways throughout the delta in case roads are flooded, or you can take major highways to kind of get where you need to be. And like I said, we stock sandbags, rocks, and things like that. And let's see, the next slide. We also have other locations in the Delta. So the Rio Vista Material Storage Facility, Delta Flood Emergency Management Plan kind of highlights the how to respond in the Delta should there be an emergency. And then the Delta Emergency Response Tool, that's essentially a decision support tool where you can plug in information and it will give you scenarios. And we also have a Delta working group that we participate in, kind of providing resources and information. Next slide kind of highlights the Delta Levy program. We have the Delta Levy Maintenance and Subventions program.
Stealing my thunder, man.
Oh, sorry. I'll pass the to Brian.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
No problem. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries. Hey, Gil, first of all, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate to be presenting in front of the Delta Stewardship Council again. And I think Sherman Island, we were talking about subsidence last time. So out on Sherman Island, which was a great opportunity to see before the whole, and that was back in last year before the storms hit. So it looks very similar now. And Gil, I do remember that forklift on Twitchell Island. In fact, in 2007, I was the one on the forklift loading sandbags. So, but I was trained. I did have certification for that. And I'm sure Mike did too, just to clear the record. So the Delta Department of Water Resources, Delta Levees Subventions Program, our motto is ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that really shows up in how the Delta responded this year. The last significant levee breach in the Delta was Jones Track, and that was a June 3rd, so it wasn't during high water events. June 3rd of 2004. So we've been investing a lot of money into the Delta, and it has really shown. There were a couple, Gil mentioned Van Sickle in the Sassoon Marsh was a levee breach this year, and it's got a different levee standard out there. The other island that did flood was McCormick Williamson, but that too has restricted heights, levee heights, and is really intended to flood to take some of the pressure off of Stones area and some of that I-5 area as well. We have two significant programs that we implement during times of emergency response. Fortunately, we haven't had to really be significantly active through the funding programs. But the subventions program can provide up to $50,000 per island per event with a maximum of $200,000. So it's not a lot of money out there, but we do spend, and it's been going up every year for maintenance. I think this year we're going to have about a $13.5 million operations and maintenance. So we really want to go into the flood season making sure that every single island is prepared, has what it needs, is up to standards. The other thing that we have is the special projects program. In fact, we just released a PSP, and we'll be announcing hopefully very soon the recipients of $37 million for levee improvements, multi-benefit levee improvements. And we did get applications that were greater than that. So as we get money, we really do try to improve the levees. We had a program, PSP, 2013, Gil? 2012, which there are different standards of levees in the Delta or different geometries, one of which is HMP, Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is something that we agreed to with FEMA to ensure at the time that we had FEMA funding if those levies were up to the standards. And through that funding, through Proposition 1E, through 84 and some other propositions, we did bring all of the levies at that time, if they could, with exception of McCormick-Williamson, which is statutorily limited, up to that HMP. And now that we start to get additional funds and have additional PSPs, we're moving towards increasing that to different levels of standards. Bulletin 19282, Bulletin 19282, and PL 8499, which are greater levy standards. But I think the point here is that we take O&M very seriously. We put our money where our mouth is. We try to fund as much levy operations and maintenance as we can to make sure that we go into every single year prepared. So I think it's really shown. 2004 is the last time. Before that, significant levy breaks, from the 20s all the way through, the early 2000s. So, yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Before we go to questions, I just want to add a little bit more context to the importance of emergency response and management. Delta levees can fail in a number of ways, and overtopping is only one of them. Other ways involve if the wind is high and the waves it's blowing water over the top of the levee, you have erosion on the backside. You can have tunneling through the levee itself. There's just a lot of ways that we can have a significant flood event. And the way that you prevent that from happening is you have effective emergency response, you have people on the ground, you have reclamation districts that are monitoring the levees, looking for these areas, and then responding appropriately. In both of the presentations, they had pictures of flood fighting actually happening on the ground, where people are putting visqueen on the levee to stop the erosion and to protect the levee. Or I didn't see any pictures this time, but they're putting sandbags around a boil so that that you don't have under seepage or piping that is undermining the foundation. All of these things are critical for ensuring that we don't have a massive levee failure. And emergency response preparedness is just such an important part of that. And I want to thank our panel today for coming and talking about that, because I think this is one of those things that doesn't get enough attention. So with that, I will hand it over to questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Erin. And thank you to our presenters. Questions. We'll start with Councilmember Lee and then Councilmember Burgess.
Yeah, thank you for those words, Erin. That's kind of what I was going to say. I have a passion for emergency management, and over the last 2 administrations, I was lucky enough to be appointed by both governors, and I spent countless hours at the Office of Emergency Services in the State Operations Center, and you all just do incredible work there. And I think that might even be a great field trip for us to take at some point, because until you really see the State Operations Center in full mode, you don't realize the power that this state has to respond to emergencies. It's unprecedented. It is a beacon and a model for the country, and other states come to us to ask us how we handle emergencies. It is incredibly well done. And I know DWR always has a really big presence during almost all of the emergencies that I've been there for, whether it's fire and responding to, rain after a fire event and how we prevent runoff and all of those things, to the Oroville Dam and the team that I was on that helped with that disaster. It's a very robust system, and I'm glad that you guys are publicly getting some acknowledgement for all the hard work you do around that.
Great. Thank you for those comments. Councilmember Burgess.
Thank you. I wear a lot of different hats, and as a county supervisor, I can say an ounce of prevention is definitely worth a pound of cure, as was said. One of the things that I observed, and you guys talked about it as a system, and a lot of the things that you guys were addressing are the levees, the big flows coming. I was getting to deal with a lot of the things right on the ground. And one of my observations is that similar to fire prevention, we need to really invest in teaching people about drainage from their own properties. We have people that are buying properties that don't even understand kind of why certain systems are on their land. They cover them up. They don't realize it affects the neighbors. The neighbors, everything starts to build up. It affects the community. And then on top of that, there's the infrastructures, whether it's a county road and public works and their drainage, an irrigation district, a service district that, is doing the pumping, but not everything is draining to those things. And so I'm requesting, not just making a comment, but I'm requesting that we could invest in that type of prevention. I just feel like if we can do the things on the ground that can prevent the bigger problems, that could be helpful. And I don't know if this is kind of a unique situation where I'm at. I suspect it's not, but I do think that as people move into the mountains where they're near, where they're going to have to be aware of fire prevention, or they're moving out to these rural places where they have drainage that they need to be aware of, I think it helps. And then we start talking about insurance costs and all of those other things. So I appreciate all the work. And I think the other thing to remember was this was a significant event that we've experienced. And a lot of people are just panicking about it. And, they're demanding these big changes. And, as we've seen from our scientists, we don't know if climate change, these are patterns that are going to be the new normal. But I do think we need to invest in teaching people how to manage their own drainage and to work as a system, because that's what it is, starting from, a neighbor to a neighbor to an infrastructure of, an irrigation district or whatever it is. We really need to. And so when I see these investments with it was the Delta Flood ER grants, would that grant program be available to, say, to a community so that they could teach people on the ground how to deal with their drainage? If and you can answer me later if you're not sure.
So the grant program, it's basically for the public agency,
right,
that is responsible for the flood emergency and prevention. To implement anything on somebody's property, it wouldn't really go that way.
What happens is it happens on their property, and then it affects the neighbor, and then it affects the whole community, and so then it does affect the agency.
Right. We do have actually a flood fight training class and a program within EWR that we have flood fight specialists that come out to the city, the county, the LMA, whoever's interested. It's most effective when you have a group of people. So, let's say if the county was to do it, they can put on this public announcement that we're going to have flood fight training available. So we'll come out, we'll train the county, and it's open. It could be open to the public. We'll teach how to place sandbags, how to fill sandbags, what to do with it. Inherently, there's a part of it where it does talk about drainage, and sometimes the drainage itself isn't enough just because you have so much excessive water. So what do you do then? So how do you flood fight? And a lot of that information is very applicable to the homeowners where, you've got your garage door is kind of low on your property. How do you make sure that the effort that you put in, it's effective and you don't get water in your house? That's the big thing. Is we can provide the county with sandbags and they're going to give it out to the locals, but they're going to fill them up improperly and deploy them incorrectly, and they're going to say, well, we've put sandbags, but we still got flooded. And there's a method to installation of those sandbags, and that's not even part of the grant program. That's available upon request in a way. So just contact the Flood Operations Center, and then we can set you up with, the flood fight specialist, put you on schedule, and we'll come out and provide that training. That's probably the easiest and most immediate way to kind of get that information out there, especially the flood season is coming up. So
Yeah,
that information is, we're systematically kind of training not only one specific area, but it's open statewide. We have requests. I'm sure Gil has been to those training classes before.
I think 3 town halls planned just to address that issue. And so it's not just one community, it's numerous communities. So
right, the grant program, it's more of a larger scale, like, a plan, like how would you address, as a town, as an area, if it's an island in the Delta, what are your problems? Where's your high ground? What are you going to do when the water comes? So it's a bigger plan than just somebody's house per se, but you can definitely get those people in that island that live there involved in that plan and train them up and kind of take them under your wing within that grant program. But the grant program is going to be primarily geared towards an agency.
we also have low income folks that have owned their properties for, decades and just don't have the income to be able to invest in upgrading the systems as, things have changed. They've been built, previous to any of the building, codes or, understanding of, so if there was also some sort of program to assist, low income people to be able to do their best, I think it also impacts, insurance costs or state or federal burdens to, fix bigger problems if they can, lower. I'm pushing because I can tell you, sitting down with people and the fear and the frustration is really tough. And I'm this isn't criticism. This is just me saying it's a whole system, and this part of the system is really hurting.
Yeah, it'll definitely be beneficial working with consultants like Gil to help you with how do you put that project together that will demonstrate a public benefit. Gil?
Yeah, I wanted to just add a little bit to that. So recently, the state had a small community grants program, which granted funds for the first phase was to study the vulnerability of small communities. And then the next phase would be to plan repairs. And then third phase would be to implement those repairs. So the Delta had a lot of those studies done because there are a lot of small communities, and as we're up the river too. One thing that jumped out on Grand Island, which has a little higher population than most islands, but it's also got 17,000 acres of farmland around it. During the process of drafting this vulnerability type study, we held a public meeting, and a couple of landowners showed up that own property or own houses in Clampett Tract, which is West Walnut Grove, across from the main part of Walnut Grove. And they didn't even know what a reclamation district was. And they paid $15 a year as their assessment, and they always complained about it. Now they realize, oh my gosh, you guys are spending all this money. These farmers are kicking in tens of thousands of dollars for their ranches every year to keep these levies up. You guys work with the state to get money, and on and on and on. So it was interesting to me because about 10 years before that, when Grand Island was trying to get the word out on some of the things they do, Rec District number 3 does, we had a nice big public meeting at the firehouse in Walnut Grove and showed people what the levy districts do, where your assessment goes. And so I think periodically levy districts have to do that. I don't know if it's something that the state can grant money for, but certainly after the power outage problems we had, it's obvious that if this happens again, you're going to flood homes out, because once those ditches, canals start overflowing because the rec districts can't pump the water out, you're getting close to homes. As far as some of the lower income people, what's interesting is that sometimes a lot of those are farm workers, and historically they've been the ones that may be still around during the winter to help us throw sandbags and stuff. So they know more about flooding sometimes more than people that never look outside their window to wonder what's going on that levee over there. So yeah, there's a lot of education, and I think this year kind of pointed that out. On Grand Island alone, we had like 20 power poles all in a row topple over during those. And old timers that were out there said they've never seen any power poles all over, and trees came down like you wouldn't believe, blocking the levee roads. You couldn't get around these districts. So it was a different flood. We didn't have the storm surge, just like hurricanes. Sometimes we get a low pressure system come in, like in 1998 and 2006, that just sucks the water up, and we didn't have that. So the Central Delta didn't get the high 100-year flood type water surfaces, but the problems occurred elsewhere with the power outages and some of the other things.
Well, want to thank you all for a tremendous and great presentation. We're going to have to move it along, but don't want to forget, I absolutely love the idea that Councilmember Lee just introduced, you know, the possibility of actually doing a field trip. In my previous life, having worked for the Office of Emergency Services in my county, and just recognizing the role that it takes. But I want to take it one step further in our further conversation in terms of how do we do effective engagement and outreach to communities of color, communities that have normally not been part of the process. Would love to have a further discussion with this council, with you, with all of you. Would like to dig a little deeper on this emergency plan and what does it entail, and how do we plan to make sure that things like what happened in Maui not too long ago, recognizing that some people were not properly aware or not informed, lack of sirens, lack of, again, communication, to your point earlier, Gil, there was no system in place, an effective system in place, and to see that people perished because they didn't know what was coming down the pipeline. How do we avoid catastrophes such as this in the Delta? Do we have a siren system? Do we have, again, a meaningful way to be able to engage with community residents through cell phone, through AM frequency, which I understand that it's on the chopping block, but would love to have a deeper conversation around that with all of you. So thank you again, very much appreciate it.
Can I add one other piece to your agenda on that upcoming
Absolutely.
conversation that I much look forward to? OES has a division that deals with access and functional needs during emergencies as well. And the disability community oftentimes gets overlooked in a crisis. And it's always a part of the emergency management plan everywhere we go, is how are we incorporating the needs of the disabled. So I just want to sort of pile that onto what your agenda was.
Would love that. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you again, Aaron and Gil, Max, and Brian. Appreciate your time. We will now move on to item 11. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Public comment. Is there any public comment on this item?
Not at this location, Madam Chair.
Excellent.
Neither are here. No, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. We will now move on to item number 9, the Knightson Wetland Restoration and Flood Protection. And we have our Deputy Executive Officer Planning Director, Jeff Henderson. Jeff. And I apologize, we're running just a few minutes behind, and appreciate your patience. So thank you.
Absolutely. Good morning, council members. Still morning. Good morning, council members. It's a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit about the Knightson Wetland Restoration and Flood Protection Project. This is a very interesting project. Next slide, please. Very interesting project in a lot of ways, but one of the most important ways that from the council's perspective is that this is being implemented through the administration's key emphasis lately on cutting the green tape, which is a phrase that you have probably heard in different settings throughout our service to the Delta. One of the aspects of that cutting the green tape program is the creation of a statutory exemption under the California Environmental Quality Act for certain restoration projects, and those projects would need to meet specific criteria that you'll hear a little bit more about today. One of the projects that has come forward to utilize that CEQA exemption is the Knightson Wetland Restoration and Flood Protection Project in Contra Costa County in the western portion of the Delta. So we'll hear a little bit from the Habitat Conservancy responsible for that project about some of the characteristics of the project and the factors that led to utilization of the SERP. And then we'll talk a little bit about how this all relates to the Delta Plan and the potential for that project to be or not be a covered action under the Delta Reform Act. Next slide, please. So the statutory exemption for restoration projects, which we'll probably start referring to as the SERP process, is a part of the Public Resources Code that was introduced through legislation in 2021. That it essentially creates an exemption for restoration projects under the California Environmental Quality Act. And that exemption basically means that the project wouldn't prepare an initial study or a mitigated negative declaration or an environmental impact report that it would otherwise be required to prepare. CEQA includes a number of exemptions for different types of activities, and this one was added by the legislature in 2021 to advance the pace and the scale of habitat restoration throughout the state. And that's important. This is a statewide program, not a Delta-specific program. It's administered by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Again, projects that are seeking to use the SERP must meet specific qualifying criteria for that exemption. The lead agency that's sponsoring the project or approving the project must determine that that project is exempt from CEQA. And then in turn, the director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife must concur with that lead agency's determination. And that concurrence has to be based on some criteria that the council is well familiar with: substantial evidence and best available science, which are the same criteria we use in our review of appeals of potential covered actions. So I'm going to hand it over to Pete McHugh from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who's going to give us a presentation on the statutory exemption for restoration projects and how that whole process came around and how it is implemented, and some of the dynamics of implementing that process within the Delta. So welcome, Pete. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And next slide, please. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm Pete McHugh with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm with the Bay Delta region, based in Santa Rosa myself. I'm one of two regions that serve the legal Delta and the department's Cutting the Green Tape program for restoration, permitting, and grants. Part of a larger statewide program, and I'm actually joined back here by our statewide program manager, Brad Henderson. And we are, as Jeff alluded to, designed to increase the pace and scale of restoration. Next slide, please. As we all heard already, pace and scale is the objective here, trying to meet the task of 30 by 30 and other initiatives to increase the conserved and restored lands across the state. The program is really built on kind of three legs here, one being funding good restoration projects across the state, the permitting element, which is what we're really here to talk about this morning, and the CEQA exemption specifically, and then also providing project support. So a lot of members of our program are both grant managers and folks that work on permitting, and connecting those two elements really helps accelerate restoration. Next slide, please. On our program's restoration permitting front, we serve a few different purposes in addition to the CEQA exemption that we'll talk about here in a moment, primarily focusing on CDFW's role for endangered species and fully protected species take authorizations that are necessary at times to implement restoration projects, and also administering some of our permitting related to Fish and Game Code Section 1600 and lake and stream bed alteration permitting. Next slide, please. Oop, there we go. So SERP, the CEQA statutory exemption for restoration projects. Oh, I think we skipped a slide there. I jumped out. Perfect. So as Jeff mentioned, this came about in late 2021. This is a new exemption for restoration projects of any size. Previously, there still is an exemption, a categorical exemption for projects that are relatively small, less than 5 acres. In the Delta, that's not a very big project by any measure, so a tool such as SERP is really an important development for restoration permitting and fast-tracking CEQA compliance. When it was authorized, it was set to sunset at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025. But folks hope that that does continue given the success of this exemption thus far. So how does this work? So probably the best way to understand it is to look at the language of the statute itself. So specifically, there's this arrangement where lead agencies make a determination as to whether their projects meet the criteria of the exemption. Subdivisions A through D. A really focuses on whether or not the project is a bona fide restoration project, a project that is designed exclusively to improve habitat and help recover native fish and wildlife. So kind of the first criteria is that this is a project focused on restoration. That said, the statute also includes language saying that incidental benefits can be part of a project. So a project is not eligible just by virtue of having some incidental benefits, such as public access and recreation. Next slide, please. And this is subdivision C. It should actually have a C there, but the other criteria is that projects need to provide long-term benefits to sensitive species recovery and climate resiliency. I think in the Delta, it's fairly evident that we have confronting issues: sea level rise, increasing salinity. Those are elements that would have to be considered in long-term management of a restoration project, perhaps. And then in addition, procedures for ongoing management and protection of the environment. So this is your sort of standard avoidance and minimization measures during project implementation, but perhaps also some adaptive management elements further on down the line of a project's implementation. And then lastly, the subdivision D is focused on projects are not eligible if they include construction that is essentially not related to restoration. So all construction activities that are authorized through this exemption are truly have to be related to the restoration itself. And as I said, the arrangement of this exemption's operation is that the lead agency makes the determination and then seeks the CDFW director's concurrence with their findings for subdivisions A through D. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about how that has worked in operation. So essentially, to administer this, we've created an ability to consult with the department beforehand, sort of a pre-submittal concurrence to discuss the project and the parties' sentiments regarding its fit under the statute and the evidence and behind that determination. During that process, we also make our best recommendations. It's not something we can require per the exemption, but that folks should be doing a good job with doing outreach to Native American tribes as well as other stakeholders. And then once they've done their work, they prepare a package, their initial determination, submit that to the department, and we'll review that. And following receipt of a concurrence, they are then required to file a notice of exemption with the Office of Planning Research at the time that they complete their discretionary, within 48 hours of completing their discretionary action leading to the project. So on our end, again, we review the package and prepare a concurrence for the director's review and approval, and review the, again, substantial evidence and best available science in support of that determination. Once concurrences are issued, we also are required to post those on our website, and I'll show you where those live here on the next slide in a second. And when this exemption came into being late in 2021, there were definitely some expressed sentiments and concerns about its use in the legal delta and to accelerate restoration specifically without a CEQA, a very public CEQA process, i.e. through a CEQA exemption. And we have heard that and are doing our best job to approach it slightly differently in the Delta. So specifically, as we'll hear about from Jeff in a moment, kind of acknowledging that there is an additional overarching regulatory context with the Delta plan and what is or is not a covered action once it's exempted through CEQA. And then in addition, kind of the importance of enhanced outreach and really making sure that folks are doing good by the neighboring properties and the other uses that may be affected by a restoration activity. And specifically, we're pointing to the Good Neighbor, the Delta Plan's Good Neighbor checklist kind of as a framework to pursue that kind of outreach. Again, acknowledging the statute doesn't allow us to require these sorts of things, we're just strongly recommending it for the success of the project and ultimately for the exemption to be a useful tool for restoration. Next slide, please. So in terms of where things live on our webpage, you can find a bit more about how to initiate a consultation, the sort of hidden panel on the underside. There's some bars on the left you can follow through. But more importantly, you can also find all the concurrences that are posted there on that website. And the URLs on the bottom will be available in the slides later. Next slide, please. So how has this worked? So we're now, I guess, 18 months, no, more than that, 20 months since the first concurrence was issued, I think, thereabouts. And so far, it's become a fairly well-oiled machine, and it's operating as a good process. We've engaged or been requested to engage in over 100 consultations to date. We've issued 32 concurrences on lead agency's findings, one of which has been in the Delta, which we'll hear about in a moment for Abby's project. And these projects really do encompass a broad range of project types and complexity, some that are quite large. In total, the concurrences to date encompass more than 15,000 acres. But it includes everything from relatively small footprint stream restoration projects to landscape scale restoration of several thousand acres. Importantly, we do a follow-up survey with lead agencies to find out what using this exemption meant to them in terms of project savings and time savings to getting their project to permitting and implementation, to a fully permitted implementation stage. And thus far, we're finding approximately 7 months and about $100,000 in project savings. And that's, of course, just at the project level. In terms of CEQA process, of course, all sorts of other agencies that have a discretionary action that may be related to the implementation. Us, for instance, in issuing a take authorization would have to comply with CEQA, and having that additional process to monitor and comply with, we can also lean on the exemption. So I think there's an unquantified additional savings there to be aware of. And then lastly, I think that's likely to be even bigger given the scope and scale of some of the restoration projects that are envisioned in the Delta. So that's kind of the recap of where we're at to date. And I think at this point, transition it over to learn a bit more about Abby's project specifically.
Right. Thank you, Brad. And before we transition to Abby, just wanted to build a little transition from hearing about the exemption program to now hearing about the project that's using the exemption program. And one thing you may be asking yourself at this point is, why are we so concerned with the CEQA exemption? And the principal reason for that is that generally projects within the Delta that are subject to CEQA have the potential to be covered actions. You cannot be a covered action if you're not subject to CEQA. So we'll talk a little more at the conclusion of Abby's presentation about why that's significant for us from a covered actions perspective, but wanted to kind of provide that basis for sort of why are we talking so much about CEQA? Yeah. And it's because it impacts us from a covered actions perspective.
Thanks, Jeff. That was actually on my little notes here, so thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay. So now we're going to switch to talking about the Knights and Wetland Restoration and Flood Protection Project, which is proposed by the East Contra Costa County Habitat Conservancy. The Conservancy has made a preliminary determination that the Knightson project meets the SERP criteria that Brad outlined. And the director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has issued a concurrence that's available on the website that Brad showed us in his presentation. I think it's important, and Abby will hit on this in her presentation, it's important to note that there's two specific things that we, in our evaluation of this project, see as very important considerations. One is the use of the Good Neighbor Checklist that Brad alluded to, which is implementing Delta Plan Recommendation ERRB. Those members who were present with us as we were processing the ecosystem amendment will recall our conversations concerning the Good Neighbor Checklist and the importance of that in reducing potential residual effects of restoration projects on neighboring properties. And importantly, the Conservancy also received a letter from the Delta Counties Coalition supporting both the project and its use of the exemption. So those are two factors that we considered fairly important that Abby will discuss. And importantly, we've been coordinating. We've been in conversation with CDFW and the Conservancy for a few months at this point, and are really pleased to be bringing this project forward for the council's background and interest in the project itself. So with that, I'll hand it over to Abby. Thank you.
And Jeff, before we transition to Abby, I think something that many of us are probably very interested in is how you ended up getting a letter like this, because it's all fine and good to satisfy the criteria in the legislative exemption, which no small feat, and obviously very carefully calculated to only allow certain projects to use this exemption. But in the Delta, getting the community support is perhaps the most impressive part. So if you could reveal your magic on that, I think we'd be most interested.
Well, I'd also like to disclose that I'm the chair of the East Contra Costa Habitat Conservancy, and I'm also a member of the Delta County Coalition.
So what she's saying, really.
Well, thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, great. You're controlling it, Jeff. Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Pete, for this. And thanks for the introduction. My name is Abby Fateman. I am the Executive Director of the East Contra Costa County Habitat Conservancy. These people are not here for me. I'm pretty sure. And I'm happy to be here. This is my first time meeting with the council. So thank you for having me. I think this is really a case study in using the SERP and look at how it might actually play out in the Delta. We've been working on the Knightson Wetland Restoration Project for over 10 years. And if we can go to the next slide. I want to provide some, I know we don't have a ton of time, but I want to provide background on the project and what we're really looking at going, where we are now and where we're going to, and the process that we are on. So this is a project in East Contra Costa County. We are in the Western Delta near the community of Knightson. The project has two landowners. It's really the East Bay Regional Park District, which is an implementing partner with my agency in implementing our local habitat conservation plan and natural community conservation plan. We do have a project team that has been working with us through much of the time on site designs, working on groundwater and soils, and outreach and communication. We have been fortunate to have funders from the federal level to the extremely local level over our 10 years that have been engaged from when we started scratching our heads about this property when it first went on the market to actually helping us buy it, to helping us get to where we are now. And some of those funders are in this room. So thank you, Delta Conservancy and the county, Contra Costa County. And hopefully there'll be other funders to add to this list in the future. To the next slide. In a nutshell, we are working to transform a 645-acre property that has been managed primarily as irrigated, agricultural, and pasture to a mosaic of habitats to support special status species. Of this 645 acres, about half of it will end up being wedded habitat, from freshwater tidal wetlands to transitional habitat, as well as half of it being grassland, oak savanna, and interior dune habitat, which we have on site as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? For folks who are not familiar with East Contra Costa County, here is a slide showing generally where we are. We are south and east of the Dutch Slough project, which maybe you're more familiar with, but not too far away. Can we get the next slide? Moving in a little closer on the project site, this is our 645-acre property. At the southeast corner of the property is No Name Slough, which is not a slough you're probably familiar with. But to the north of the project site is Rock Slough, which is the Contra Costa Water District intake for the area, which you might be more familiar with. So we are separated by a parcel, which is Veal-Track, I think is Reclamation District 2065, and I apologize if I get that number wrong. They're a neighbor to our north and to our east. So this is where we are on the landscape, and as you can see, when this photo was taken, it was active irrigated agriculture, and we kept it in that state till we got a little closer to breaking ground. So right now it is currently all pasture. We have removed a lot of the infrastructure from the irrigated ag. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we bought this property and embarked on this project to protect the land from development, to restore habitat and reconnect this property to the Delta, and improve water quality discharging to the Delta, water that moves through this property and out into No Name Slough. Can you go to the next slide, please? As I mentioned, this has been, for us, a long project, maybe for a Delta project, not a long project. We started thinking about this in 2012 when the property went on the market, and we conducted feasibility studies looking to see if this was even something that was feasible to do. It's one thing to buy a property adjacent to the Delta. It's another thing to know that it's actually a reasonable effort to restore it. So we were looking at elevations, how subsided it was, what were our target species. So we started that process in 2012. We actually bought the property in 2016. And from there, it has been a fairly fast project with significant funding from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Delta Conservancy to move through assessments, concept designs, and we are currently working on, as you can tell, permitting as we move to the final stages of design. We are hoping to break ground in 2025, and we're excited about it. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we have done, as I mentioned, many studies, and one of the reasons why I'm touching on some of these elements, because they are also elements that you would normally see in a CEQA assessment. And so even though we are working through a statutory exemption from CDFW, we have not thrown the standards to the wayside. We are working through a rigorous scientific method in developing this project and have engaged in multi-year studies of the hydrology, the groundwater, the habitat, and all the conditions on site. Go to the next slide, please. We have engaged the community. This started before we bought the project in 2012. This slide really just reflects the last few years of work that we've been doing and where we are in the project. So we have 2 more community meetings, which we plan to complete this year, which will be the 65% design conversation, as well as a site visit where the community can come on site. Right now, it's not open to the public. It's not safe for the public to wander about on site. It is an active grazing property. We're also working through environmental permits. So this is one of the first things we've done is to work through CEQA, but we are in the process of developing all the other permit applications associated with the project. And we are working towards 65% designs, which we expect to have in hand this fall, and we'll move quickly into 90 and 100% designs from there. The next slide. So in addition to doing local community outreach, we have done regional outreach. So as mentioned before, we did complete the Good Neighbor Checklist, which was part of our SERP application. And we did receive this letter from the Delta Counties Coalition, which actually, I know it's a high bar to reach, but this project actually met the criteria of what the Delta Counties Coalition is looking for in a project. And so when the actual ask was made and the conversations were had about the project, I wasn't actually in the room, the conversation, but it does seem like it wasn't something that was extraordinary. It was the first time it was being requested, but in terms of what was expected from a project, we were checking the boxes and working collaboratively with the folks who needed to engage. And I guess I'll turn over to.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt just a little bit. It was reviewed by the Technical Advisory Committee to the Delta County Coalition. So it wasn't just the county supervisors that are members, but it was their technical advisory that looked at it from all those different angles. And you got to remember, each of the counties have a different relationship with the Delta and with the way they look at this. So it was reviewed by the technical advisory and then brought to the committee.
Thanks for that clarification. I was not actually privy to what happened after I made the request and crossed my fingers. So, so that's where we are. And Supervisor, Councilmember Burgess, I apologize. You wear many hats. Probably can provide additional information that I am not privy to. But it was a thoughtful request, and it wasn't made casually. You go to the next slide. So I know I'm taking a lot of your time, so I'm gonna try to keep on moving. So we'll just go to the next slide. As you saw before, this is what the site looks like right now. And we started with, as any project does, a bunch of different concepts and different scenarios. And we really kept in mind what were our goals. So if we can go to the next slide, please. My agency and the East Bay Regional Park District, our goals are habitat conservation. And we are designing a project to conserve habitat, restore habitat for special status species in the Delta area. And there are some species that are target species for my agency, and there are other species that we expect to benefit from the project. And so we really looked at creating habitat, and that was our focus. And that's what our agency's goals are. The next slide, please. So as with any project, you come up with a few different scenarios, you work through them. Are they feasible? Will they address your concerns? What provides the most benefit with the fewest risks? And we started with some fairly cartoonish designs. If you go to the next slide. And we developed those into 35% designs, and we're in the process of finalizing our 35 and moving into 65% designs. And the project has evolved, and it will continue to evolve as we work through the engineering and have final conversations with partner agencies and the community. Can you have the next slide, please? So as I mentioned earlier, about half the project will end up being some sort of wedded or wedded adjacent habitat to support species, and about half the project site will continue to be upland. This is not a subsided property. The entire property is above sea level. So we will be bringing in tidal sloughs. We will be creating tidal sloughs to bring in tidal fresh water. I realized as I was looking at this a little bit later, this looks like, oh, most of the project's going to be grassland. And that's why I'm, because this pie chart separates slough, freshwater tidal, seasonal, wetland transition. If you lump those all together, it's about half the project site. So it's about half wedded or wet adjacent type habitats. And the rest is grassland, oak savanna, and we do have remnant, about 20 acres of remnant interior dune habitat on the property. It's beach sand, it feels like. It's pretty spectacular to come across if you haven't been exposed to wandering into that habitat by accident as you're walking through a pasture. So we're excited to see what we can do in terms of some restoration of that habitat type. Next slide. Next slide, please. So next steps, we're going to complete our project design and our construction documents. We'll work on finalizing permits. And while we're doing that, we are working to secure construction funding and funding for early implementation actions, things like preparing vegetation, getting nurseries set up so that after we grade, we don't have just dirt, we have plants to put in the ground. So we're actually working on seed collection and developing relationships with nurseries. 645 acres is a lot of land to revegetate. We are excited to get to this final stage of realizing the final design, getting our permits in place, and ultimately securing funding, which is what makes it happen. So I appreciate your time. Happy to answer any questions. And I want to thank again Pete and the CDFW Cutting the Green Tape team. This is a new process that we are navigating. And also thank you, Jeff, for bringing this to the council.
Excellent.
Thank you, Abby. And I'll go ahead and close this out. We've heard about the process. We've heard about the project. Now here's where we come in. Typically, this type of a habitat restoration or a flood protection project would meet the definition of a covered action, because typically it would be triggering CEQA. And then we would be looking at our 4 or 5 criteria that then demonstrate whether or not something is a covered action as provided for in the Reform Act. However, our regulations also state that projects that are exempt from CEQA are not covered actions unless there are unusual circumstances, and those unusual circumstances need to indicate a reasonable probability that the project would have a substantial positive or negative impact on the achievement of one or both of the co-equal goals for the Delta or implementation of a government-sponsored flood control program. So the way that we've evaluated this is following the regulation that essentially says if it's exempt from CEQA, it's not a covered action unless there are these circumstances. So we've heard about that we've heard about aspects of the project as well. Project objectives and the use of the Good Neighbor checklist align with many of the Delta Plan objectives. And our staff reviewed the project, consulted with CDFW, consulted with the Habitat Conservancy, and has not identified those unusual circumstances. And we do note the Delta County's coalition letter further supports that conclusion. There's also not the sort of local objections that you might anticipate to a project, because as Abby indicated, they went through a deliberate process. So we have discussed this understanding with both CDFW and the Habitat Conservancy staff. And pursuant to the council's regulations, the Knightson project is not a covered action, doesn't meet the definition of a covered action. And the Habitat Conservancy at this time does not intend to submit a certification of consistency to the project for the council, considering this CEQA exemption and the lack of unusual circumstances. So no council actions requested at this time. We're merely bringing this forward to you for consideration and understanding. I will say staff is aware that there are additional habitat restoration projects in the Delta that intend to use the SERP exemption in a similar manner to how the Knightson project has proceeded. Staff will carefully consider the facts and merits of each individual case. This unusual circumstances filter is really geared toward what are the specifics going on with this project at this location with these characteristics. And does that lead us to a place where there are these unusual circumstances? So we're also actively participating, I think as recently as earlier this week, with Pete and Brad and their team at CDFW on early consultation processes for SERP projects in the Delta. We have a working understanding that as the CDFW proceeds with its consultation meetings on these projects, that we will also engage in those discussions and ensure that the project proponents are aware of the Delta Plan considerations and the potential. There is potential that a project could be exempt from CEQA and still a covered action, but it has to trip this unusual circumstances clause.
Okay, well, that was an excellent presentation, by the way. I think that you all did a fabulous job, and yeah, when I saw this, I thought, wow, this is worth gold, honestly. So congratulations on that. Questions from the council?
Well, I just wanted to kind of highlight one of the things that was gone over, and this is for habitat restoration. When you're talking about construction of other things, then you're out of luck on this particular thing. So I'm really excited that we're doing this, because this is saving money on the cost of going through CEQA. and it's saving time to let us get to those projects that we really need to get done. So this is, in the spirit of, eliminating the green tape, getting these projects done. It's never going to be less expensive, and, it's timely. So I just want to appreciate the fact that we're, doing this.
Okay. Councilmember Zingali and then Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. So one of the criteria for the exemption, if I understood correctly, is that there have to be long-term environmental benefits. I wonder if y'all could just very generally give us a sense of what the long-term environmental benefits are of this project.
I'm not gonna arm wrestle you. Thank you for the question. We are building habitat for threatened and listed species. Our agency is committed to maintaining and managing that habitat in perpetuity. We have an endowment set up for all of our projects and the lands that we acquire in collaboration with our partners. And so the long-term benefits really are that we will be creating, managing, and adaptively managing that over the long term. And we are a local agency that is a committed partner in this region.
Awesome. And is there a process for affirming that, some accountability down the road that kind of monitors whether in fact the long-term benefits of the project were realized, like a reporting back or something?
That's a great question. So as an agency, we provide annual reports on all of our conservation activities, and we're operating under permits from CDFW and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So there is accountability to that particularly. There will be, as with any project that moves dirt in our region, annual monitoring reports, for at least until we hit success criteria. And then those reports become not annual, but continue to be monitored and reported on. Generally, with public funding, there is some obligation to ensure that the benefit lasts X number of years. I don't know if different agencies, I think, have different requirements. Some it's 20, some it's 30. So for example, a project that we completed a number of years ago with the Coastal Conservancy, we're still sending in annual reports, even though we're in year 7 or 8 to them. So I expect that we need to do that for another 20 or so years. So I assume there will be similar type of commitment with whatever funding obligations, funding we get to actually construct the project.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, you answered one of my questions, which was, are you going to retain ownership, and is there a budget for maintenance and operations? So thank you. I'm looking at the project design, and I see that the Delta Road kind of is going to be going through part of it, and that you've got an access road planned here. Is there going to be any public access to this, like a park or walking paths or anything? And then these roads made me think about a project that we approved back when I first got on the council, and people were parking on the levee and causing issues because there wasn't the right amount of parking. And then just thinking about whether you've kind of thought about the fact that if it's cool looking, people are going to stop there and walk around.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So right now there is not public access planned for this property. This is a large scale restoration project, and we sort of need to see how things play out. So that is not part of the CEQA exemption or the permits that we're applying for right now. If and when we decide to allow public access, there'll be a separate public access plan and a separate process for that. One of the things that you mentioned were roads going through the property, and I think you can see on the aerial imagery, there is a utility easement that goes through there. And so we need to guarantee access to that utility easement. So we're protecting that access down that side of the property right there. It is possible that in the future that could also provide other functions, but right now, as the project is designed and being implemented, we're not looking at public access.
Got it. It seems like there's a lot of win-win-win, and I'll just ask a off-the-cuff question. Did anybody not like it, or was there any opposition that you had to work through?
I think in the wise words of Campbell Ingram, he said to me, it's a project in the Delta Abbey. So we have done a lot of work to educate people get people comfortable with a public agency owning land in a small rural community. I can't say that everybody is on board, but we have done a huge effort to meet with people individually, neighbors in small groups, outreach to neighboring agencies. So there are a lot of wins, and I don't think I can speak for people and say that everybody agrees that they're all wins, but things that are wins to some people are not always wins to other people. But we're comfortable with the process we've gone through, and that we continue to go through and continue to be available to people who have questions.
I don't want to keep pushing the point because I love this project and I think it's wonderful. But could you maybe summarize what like the top concern might have been from people that weren't quite as thrilled about it?
I'm not sure I'm really comfortable characterizing those concerns.
I would say there were people that were speculating that there were that there could be issues with groundwater well and those kind of things. Speaking also to the issue that we were discussing earlier related to drainage, there's a lot of confusion on whose responsibility water from their own property, where it goes and who handles it. And so that was another issue. Did I give it enough? Okay. So that's how I'd characterize
it. Well, great job.
Councilmember Zingali, I still see your hand up. Do you have another question?
Sorry, a little technical difficulty there. No questions here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Other questions? If not, I'll just give you my my quick take. First and foremost, again, congratulations. I think that this is an amazing project. What you've been able to achieve, the amount of support that you've been able to gain is commendable. I'd like to follow up with you offline to see if I might be able to put a local group in my area in contact with you. I think that I think that you have literally set the bar for how others may be able to work in projects in other areas. I just think that you have just done an amazing job, and again, credit to your hard work and dedicated effort. So thank you so very much.
Chair, I just want to add, Abby is very well respected across the country as far as habitat conservancies go. And so you have a very good panelist today to demonstrate the great work that's happening across the country.
Yeah, I'm going to need your telephone number. Okay. I'm not even kidding. Is there any public comment on this item?
No, Madam Chair, there is not.
Okay.
None here,
Councilmember
thank
Kelly?
you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, thank you again very much. Excellent presentation. We are now moving on to item 12, and that is preparation for our next council meeting. The next council meeting will take place September 28th, 29th at the CNRA building, 715 P Street here in Sacramento. And again, please refer to the posted meeting announcement 10 days before our meeting. And with that, this meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.